Chapter 456. Everyone was shocked. They had been optimistic about the twin stars brothers. In fact, the two brothers were the favorites to win this competition. However, they had been effortlessly killed by Yishuan despite that. Such a battle had astonished everyone. It would have still been fine if the twin stars brothers had been defeated. However, they shouldn't have lost so easily. This had completely undermined their expectations, to the extent that they couldn't accept this for a moment. It was already too late by the time the lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall shouted. Yishuan wasn't going to stop anyway. Moreover, Yishuan also knew that he couldn't recklessly interfere in the end. He could only watch in helplessness as Yishuan killed the Xian Yuan twin stars. He looked bitterly at Yishuan, and then sat down in anger. This was the so-called "a murderer must be sentenced to death." It was hard to tell how many experts had died at the hands of the Xian Yuan twin stars. And, they too would have wished for this if they had been in his place. It's unbelievable. Yishuan has become the most terrifying expert in this competition. He possesses such frightening fighting strength. He had destroyed the offensive of the third-ranked Qi Tian very effortlessly, and he had thoroughly defeated him in the end. And now, he has effortlessly crushed the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers. It's quite hard to describe his accomplishments in words, someone spoke up in astonishment. Yeah. The Xian Yuan twin stars brothers didn't even get the opportunity to collaborate. Each of them was far superior to an ordinary Heaven's Pride expert. But, they crumpled like paper in the hands of Yishuan. In fact, they were gently crushed, and thrown into the trash can. They couldn't pose any threat to Yishuan. It can be said that they lost because they couldn't collaborate. However, does this mean that they could only defeat an opponent by relying on their numerical advantage? Were they only like a paper tiger if separated? Someone dared to open his mouth. Many people were praising these two rising stars of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall before the contest had started. However, such an outcome had made them sad. Therefore, they could only sigh with sorrow at this time. Hee hee. So, the Xian Yuan Palace Hall spent a hefty price, and made it possible for these two individuals to fight as a team because they probably knew that these two were good for nothings on their own. They were merely like a pair of paper tigers. A true martial university's disciple coldly laughed and said. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the true martial university could be described as archenemies among the four forces. So, true martial university's prestige had risen because of such an outcome, while the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had lost their pride. How could this not get the disciples of the true martial university excited? Especially when they were already quite enraged since the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers had said so many insulting words to Yishuan. Many disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall were present around that disciple. They looked at each other with glaring eyes when they heard his words. It seemed as if they would attack him. However, they also found a considerable amount of ill expressions in the eyes of many disciples of the true martial university. So, they had no choice but to let their anger drop. Yishuan is the biggest dark horse in this competition. He had become famous before the competition. He was ranked among the 8 Heaven's Pride experts. However, nobody was optimistic about his victory before the competition had started. However, he has managed to reach this stage. This has undermined everyone's prediction. His next fight is with Emperor Chen. Can he be a match for Emperor Chen? I think it's difficult to say. He possesses incredible strength. His body is also extremely tyrannical. I've heard that he has also practiced a secret technique. So, his restoration ability is very quick. Emperor Chen may not be able to deal with him. He can't deal with Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen's spatial ability has made him almost invincible in this competition. Everyone was still in shock. Meanwhile, a figure had stormed into the microcosm. Everyone looked on as that fierce figure arrived inside the microcosm. It turned out to be Emperor Chen. He was seated upright above the golden lion, and looked impressive. He was clad in an armor, and held a lance in his hand. He seemed like the reincarnation of a god of war. And, it seemed as if he was showing his contempt for the entire world. He was staring at Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold eyes. His lance was making a buzzing sound. It seemed as if it was eager to drink fresh blood. He was motionless, but he was releasing ice-cold aura in the surroundings. This would make one feel as if one had fallen into an ice hole. His mount, that golden lion, was moving and roaring even more restlessly. Even Emperor Chen's roar was quite scary. Emperor Chen. What does he want to do? Does he want to interfere with the competition? Someone asked. Isn't he afraid of receiving the joint punishment from all the four forces? Someone was left baffled, and had seemingly raised the question in anger. Insane. He's insane. What does he wish to achieve by intervening like this? Does he want to take the advantage of Yi Shiwen's present situation and kill him because he might be exhausted since his battle has ended a moment ago? Someone asked in fear. It's impossible. Emperor Chen is mistaken if he thinks so. Yi Shiwen has indeed killed two Heaven's Pride experts. However, the Xian Yuan twin stars didn't reveal their entire strength. In fact, Yi Shiwen hasn't been affected greatly. He's not exhausted. His vitality is still surging. He has maintained his peak state. Emperor Chen may think that he can get an opportunity to kill Yi Shiwen, but that's impossible. Then, why has Emperor Chen burst into the microcosm and disturbed the competition? The four forces must stop him, a disciple said. Certain rules had been established by the four forces as far as this competition was concerned. And, these established rules were absolute. People could mess around and cause chaos if there were no rules. However, nobody was allowed to act recklessly once their rules had been established. Even the lords of the major forces could at most use their voice to interfere if they wanted to intervene. But, they couldn't dare to contend against the rules. Yi Shiwen, do you dare to fight? Emperor Chen cast a glance at Yi Shiwen and challenged him. He looked at him disdainfully. I know that these two trashes didn't cause you much trouble. So, you can fight right now. Of course, you can also choose to take rest if you're afraid. We will fight later in that case. A callous smile flashed through the corner of Emperor Chen's mouth as he looked at Yi Shiwen in a cold manner. It seemed as if he was certain that Yi Shiwen would agree to a fight at the moment. The spectators held their breath. Emperor Chen was extremely audacious. He had actually burst into the microcosm, and had challenged Yi Shiwen for the fight. This was purely against the rules of this martial arts competition. The final fight for the championship had been set to take place on the final day. That day had been reserved for the finale. However, Emperor Chen wanted this fight to take place ahead of time. His actions had left everyone extremely surprised. It seemed as if these so-called rules didn't mean anything to him. He was using the goading method to indirectly force Yi Shiwen into a fight at this moment. However, the importance he was giving to Yi Shiwen was evident. He would never give so much importance to most people. Moreover, these two individuals were very special. Everyone had come to realize that these two had concealed their skills through the course of various fights. Nobody knew about the bottom line of their power because no one had been able to compel them to unleash their full strength so far. Moreover, they had effortlessly defeated the other Heaven's Pride experts as well. In fact, most people had also given up the idea of thinking too much about it. The fight between these two individuals was the biggest suspense of this martial arts competition. And, everyone was still doubtful about the victor of the championship. The Supreme Lord of the True Martial University frowned as he saw this from the tall platform. He didn't like how Emperor Chen had broken the rule on a whim. He was about to berate him. However, he heard the voice of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord before he could. The man spoke up in a mystifying manner. This young man is very courageous. I think that rules don't fit into the situations sometimes. The two of them will fight tomorrow anyway. It would be better if they fight right now, and finish this competition. Everyone would finally get to see who is better among them that way. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island looked at Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord. He knew what his counterpart's intention was. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord wanted both sides to engage in an utterly devastating struggle. It would be better if none of them would win. Then, both of them would forge a mortal enmity. And, that would be the best outcome for the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord. The participants of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had already died. So, he had nothing to do with this. Hence, it would be best for him if a deadly battle could erupt between these two. His intention obviously wasn't good. However, this matter involved a disciple of the Muddy Sky Island. So, he couldn't say much in this matter. After all, this rule of the martial arts competition had been made by the ancestors of these four forces. It had a very long history. Even these lords couldn't dare to break this rule. One must know that this competition would carry on for many times. It wasn't merely limited to this times. Other people could also randomly break the rules in the future if they would allow someone to break this rule here. And, that would expose their own disciples to death traps in the future. They would suffer more loss than gains if this happened at this moment. Such rules meant nothing for people of their stature. In fact, these rules were less valuable than toilet paper to them. The key point was whether these rules were required or not. But, it was evident that these major forces required such rules to protect their disciples. These rules would allow their disciples to compete and grow in a fair environment. The casualties of their disciples would increase if they messed up these rules. In fact, it could reach to such an extent that they wouldn't be able to bear the end result. This competition was mainly used to weaken each other's strength, and to kill the other's immature Heaven's Pride level experts in their cribs. However, some extremely powerful contender had killed several Heaven's Pride experts on many occasions. And, they've had to suffer huge losses as a result. So, the four forces had learned from their mistakes, and had decided not to send all of their Heaven's Pride experts into the competition. And, even the main objective of this competition had changed from strangling each other's geniuses to tempering one's own disciples. And, that would also allow their disciples to mature more quickly. The arrangement of this level of competition at the appropriate time allowed the young experts to gain high-level battle experience, and that was something that they often couldn't on normal days. This was also the reason why many people would make breakthroughs right after the competition ended. They simply wanted to hone the skills of their disciples. They could accept the casualties to a certain extent. However, they couldn't bear large-scale damage. The Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave opened his mouth and spoke, "I think that both of these individuals are pretty good. They are both full of vitality. However, that has nothing to do with shifting the fight to an earlier time. As for Emperor Chen's misconduct, I would like to say that the Muddy Sky Island must teach him a good lesson after he goes back home when the competition comes to an end. And, I believe that the Muddy Sky Island wouldn't be swayed by personal affection towards him. Damn it! The talented barbaric person who seems uneducated and uncouthly from the outside, is actually turned out to be the most sinister one. His belly is full of schemes and crafty plots. The other three lords silently cuss it in the secrecy of their hearts. Chapter 457, Chapter 457, Fight until the world collapses. The Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave seemed impartial this time. However, his biased attitude in favor of Emperor Chen was almost clearly visible. It seemed as if this old guy still secretly held a grudge towards Yi Shiwen for killing Qi Tian. So, he wanted to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen. Perhaps, there was an even deeper reason. Maybe he wanted both of them to lose. One must know that these two individuals possessed excessively tyrannical strength. They could easily defeat the Heaven's Pride experts of the same generation. And, this was too scary. It didn't matter who among these two individuals would win this competition. But, the said victor would become the biggest threat for the younger generation of the other forces. Therefore, it would be best if they were to mutually wound or kill each other. The lords of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the Fire Cloud Cave obviously wanted this scenario to take place. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island heard the words of the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave. However, he didn't say anything, and, that was rather unexpected. Perhaps, these two lords had made such remarks out of good intentions. However, he also knew that these two lords didn't genuinely harbor any good intentions. In fact, they weren't nice people to begin with. But, this decision was biased in favor of Emperor Qin nonetheless. Emperor Chen and Yi Shiwen had just fought their battles a few moments ago, but there was a difference of heaven and earth between their respective opponents. Emperor Chen's opponent was merely a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert. However, Yi Shiwen had faced two top Heaven's Pride experts. The results were same, and both of them had effortlessly defeated their opponents in no time. But, Emperor Chen was the one to face the resentment of the public. After all, that quasi-Heaven's Pride expert of the true martial university couldn't possibly be compared with the Xian Yuan twin stars. However, he didn't feel grateful towards the others two lords. His heart was already assured that Emperor Chen stood at the invincible position since he possessed the spatial ability. Moreover, Emperor Chen possessed tyrannical strength. In fact, his strength was beyond everyone's imagination. Therefore, he was expected to win smoothly. Even the incredible strength of Yi Shiwen would end up being useless in this case. In fact, it would be pointless since he couldn't even land an attack on Emperor Chen. He could only get thrashed by Emperor Chen, and would lose sooner or later. There wasn't any suspense attached to this battle. So, letting it take place at an earlier time would change nothing. Therefore, there was no need to treat it as a favor. The Supreme Lord of the True Martial University spoke up at this time. Let's see what he chooses. This choice must be put in the hands of Yi Shiwen. Emperor Chen's strength would also be useless if Yi Shiwen didn't agree to fight at this time. After all, he couldn't possibly contend against those extremely tyrannical great sage experts, could he? They would crush him to death within no time. Even his spatial ability wouldn't be of any use against them. They were skilled enough to rush over and kill him before he would get a chance to teleport away. Emperor Chen was coldly looking at Yi Shiwen. He looked arrogant and despotic. His monstrous aura had surged up significantly. It seemed as if he would attack Yi Shiwen and kill him right now. However, Yi Shiwen knew that Emperor Chen wouldn't dare to attack him. He would have to face the consequence if he attacked. The Supreme Lord would crush him into pieces. This was the ground reality. Yi Shiwen, do you dare to fight? Emperor Chen shouted solemnly. He was seated upright atop his mount in midair. He looked like a huge mountain, and was giving off an enormous suppression force. I will buy you a ride to hell since you're in such a hurry to die. Yi Shiwen replied coldly. His fight with the Xian Yuan twin stars hadn't affected him in any way. He might have been under a big threat if they had collaborated. However, he had made the first strike, and had gained an upper hand in the fight. He didn't even give them a chance to collaborate. He obviously got very less time to pull it off. However, he made good use of the available time, and caught them off guard. And, he managed to kill both of them as a result. Moreover, he also possessed the Phoenix regeneration technique. So, he didn't need to be afraid of successive fights. Emperor Chen was gravely mistaken if he thought that Yi Shiwen must be exhausted because of his previous battle, and that he could take advantage of it. In fact, that would be his doom. It didn't matter to Emperor Chen whether the fight would be preponed by a day, or postponed by another. It was all the same to him. This fight had to take place sooner or later. However, he wanted this battle to take place as soon as possible so that he could settle the scores without any further delay. We can finally settle the grudges from our time on the Demon Island properly. Yi Shiwen solemnly added. What? Yi Shiwen agreed to fight with Emperor Chen. How's this possible? Isn't he afraid of losing because of exhaustion? Someone asked in disbelief. Yi Shiwen wanted to fight in this situation. There was no difference between this, and deliberately getting one's head caught between doors as far as most people were concerned. Moreover, it seems that both these individuals have some past grudges. Demon Island, where is this place? Why does it sound familiar? Someone asked in a doubtful manner. I know about Demon Island. It's an island that opens once in every 50 years. And, Many young elites of the 10 countries of the Southeast region are summoned to this island, a disciple of the true Marshall University explained. He had heard the legends of the Demon Island. So, it's that Demon Island. I think it's a very strange place. It's said that many top experts of the younger generation have also stemmed from the Demon Island. However, the Demon Island bell only summons the strongest geniuses of the Southeast region. Many people had deliberately rushed there even though they hadn't been summoned. And, many of those experts located this strange place. There were several great sage experts among them too. However, they never returned from there. I didn't expect that these two individuals have already met each other on that Demon Island. So, both of them belong to Southeast region, that small region. Haha. It's ridiculous. Most outstanding disciples of the top forces of the southern region have come from the Southeast region. Many disciples had started to discuss about the Demon Island. Demon Island had a sinister reputation. It was even famous among the four forces. Many people had started to wonder that these two must have visited the Demon Island. So, they must have obtained some amazing treasures from there. After all, the Demon Island once used to be the burial place for gods according to the legends. Even Emperor Chen's mount, that golden lion, had come from the Demon Island. Yi Xuan was lean and skinny. However, he looked like the very incarnation of an ancient god at the moment. His golden divinities crawled over his entire body. And, it seemed as if he was clad in a golden divine robe. The golden divinities condensed, and surged forth as gigantic sea waves. These golden waves then smashed against the surrounding space, and shattered it. Not bad. You're genuinely courageous. Emperor Chen sneered as he looked at Yi Xuan. He knew that Yi Xuan would accept his challenge. It was impossible that he wouldn't agree to fight. Yi Xuan wasn't the kind of person who would refuse to fight. Emperor Chen had to admit that Yi Xuan was like him, at least to some extent. Both of them were extremely rigid individuals. They would prefer to die, but they wouldn't bow their heads down. Both of them were extremely arrogant and despotic in other people's opinion. They would do everything on a whim. However, the only difference was that Emperor Chen looked arrogant and despotic from outside, while Yi Xuan looked elegant and graceful. In fact, Yi Xuan was a kind-hearted person on the inside. But, people couldn't see his kindness from outside. However, he would reveal his despotic character if someone tried to provoke him. Who do you think you are? You think that you're invincible because you possess the spatial ability? Yi Xuan coldly sneered and spoke, and, by the way, you're too inquisitive about other people's business. Who doesn't know why you've arrived so late to challenge? Isn't it because you couldn't defeat your opponent earlier? Yi Xuan secretly mocked Emperor Chen, and hinted at what had happened during their last meeting. Emperor Chen had wanted to save the 8th prince at that time, but he had been too late to save him from Yi Xuan. Emperor Chen was well aware of what Yi Xuan was hinting at. However, he didn't wish to argue with him on this matter. So, he merely replied in a cold tone, "Your sharp tongue can't save your life. You can't handle my suppression." Emperor Chen added. An exceptionally murderous aura surged out from his body. And, his golden lion suddenly charged towards Yi Xuan. The golden lion's speed was extremely fast. It nearly drew a trail of golden afterimages in midair, and arrived in front of Yi Xuan within the blink of an eye. Incomparable speed shook the entire earth along with an endless amount of scary aura. And, the energy waves swept out in all directions. Even the void got shattered as a result. It was an extremely frightening spectacle. Only strength will decide who will suppress whom. Yi Xuan wasn't afraid of Emperor Chen. He rushed towards him. In fact, he seemed like an endless mountain of energy rolling over to crush Emperor Chen. Yi Xuan summoned a Han seal at this moment. A huge mountain formed in the sky, and swept down. Rumble, that mountain then smashed down at Emperor Chen's side. Emperor Chen let out a loud sonic boom. And, the sonic waves crushed that huge mountain into fine powder. Yi Xuan's pupils suddenly contracted. His face exposed a bit of solemn expression. His Han seal was the first form of the overturning the heavens seal. It was just the first type, but it still carried endless might. Emperor Chen's had shattered Yi Shiwen's Han seal with a loud shout. Something like this had happened for the first time. Emperor Chen was extremely tyrannical. In fact, he was nearly beyond his imagination. And this was the main reason why he considered Emperor Chen to be his biggest enemy in the younger generation. He had obviously given the most attention to Emperor Chen in this competition. That was because Emperor Chen posed a huge threat to him. Rumble, both of them ferociously collided. It seemed as if two tyrannical and invincible gods had suddenly knocked against each other in the sky. The sky got shattered in an instant, and this collision set off energy waves which severed the surrounding space. It looked like the doomsday was upon. Both of them attacked each other once again, and, without any hesitation. Yi Shiwen was fighting two enemies at one time since he was clashing with Emperor Chen and that golden lion at this time. The golden lion was merely a mount. However, its strength wasn't less than that of those top-level Heaven's Pride experts. So, it was extremely difficult to deal with. However, Yi Shiwen didn't fall into a disadvantageous situation while he faced them. Thanks to that, he had immediately earned himself a whole new level of respect in the eyes of many people. After all, most people felt that it would be very difficult for Yi Shiwen to win this match. Emperor Chen possessed the spatial ability, and he was almost stationed at the invincible position. Moreover, Emperor Chen and his mount were equal to two top-tier Heaven's Pride experts. And, they were far more tyrannical as a team than the Xian Yuan twin stars. They were fighting at a lightning-fast speed, and only left trails of afterimages behind them. They had already exchanged 1,000 strokes within a short time. Tyrannical shock waves overflowed in all directions as a result. Layer after layer of energy storms swept out. This scene was extremely tyrannical, and could scare a person to death. Bang! Suddenly, an explosion occurred while they were engaged in this fast-paced battle. The microcosm couldn't withstand the intensity of their battle, and shattered into pieces. Chapter 458. Bang! The aftermath of the fight between these two individuals was too frightening. The entire microcosm had collapsed. The space has the ability to restore automatically. Many legendary level experts could also rip the space apart. However, the torn space would automatically restore itself the very next second. It was impossible for them to damage it to such an extent that it couldn't self-recover. Not to mention, the bigger the world, the harder it is to destroy it. This was merely a microcosm. But, these two had exploded it into small pieces. The fight between Yi Shiwen and Emperor Chen had reached a terrifying extent. Both of them possessed extremely tyrannical strength. Those two came out of the collapsing microcosm, and landed in an arena that was located on top of the metropolis Marshall Peak. Rumble, the terrifying explosion set off a series of storms. The impact made a huge crater on that stage even though it was made of strong jade. Everyone was dumbstruck when they saw this scene. They hadn't anticipated that the fight between these two individuals would be so incredible. The Xian Yuan twin stars brothers had also broken the microcosm. However, they hadn't been able to shatter it in its entirety. The microcosm had restored itself soon enough in that case. However, these two individuals had shattered the microcosm into pieces. This microcosm was less than 100 kilometers in range. However, it was still a world in its own. It wasn't that big, and was only like a fragment of a world. But, this microcosm had been shattered so thoroughly that it had failed to restore itself. Everyone was left in awe because of this. It could be said that they had nearly been scared to death. The experts of the younger generation had especially become even more frightened and apprehensive. After all, these experts and these two individuals belonged to the same generation. Therefore, they were very concerned about the strength of these two individuals. In fact, they had a premonition that the winner of this fight would mark the beginning of a new era. And these disciples might have to live under the shadow of the winner of this battle for a very long time. They secretly compared themselves with these two individuals. However, they realized that they wouldn't stand a chance if they were to exchange places with any one of these two. These two reached to the top of the public square of the Metropolis Marshall Peak while fighting. The space on top of the Metropolis Marshall Peak had been strengthened. Therefore, it was quite difficult for them to break open the space even if they would attack with the entirety of their strength. In fact, only small cracks would appear even if they succeeded in breaking the space. However, the attacks of both of these individuals had still reached an intense and marvelous degree. None of the two was holding back one bit. "This is not fair," a disciple of Muddy Sky Island yelled. "The space above this Metropolis Marshall Peak is restricted. So, it's not that easy to shuttle back and forth in this space. It has imposed an enormous restriction on Emperor Chen's spatial ability." He had barely made this remark when the disciples of the true Marshall University suddenly looked at him bitterly. "Damn it! This bastard is too shameless. Emperor Chen possesses spatial ability. Is that any fair? Then, how's this unfair? He's talking such nonsense. Die!" Emperor Chen roared, and the released sonic boom dissipated in all directions. His aura condensed into a pillar of energy. It then soared into the sky as it reached an extremely dreadful point. His golden lion let out a long and loud roar. It brandished its sharp claws, and grabbed the air surrounding itself. An explosion occurred, and a vacuum region was consequently formed. The golden lion moved in a flash. It then suddenly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen to attack. Yi Shiwen's eyes flashed as soon as he realized that the movement of the golden lion had been much slower this time than it had been a moment ago. It hadn't used its instant teleportation ability a moment ago, but there was no doubt that it had used a certain portion of its spatial ability. Its speed had reached a terrifying level, thanks to its natural affinity for space. It was as fast as the lightning. Therefore, it was impossible for an average person to respond because the golden lion was moving too fast. Fortunately, it was Yi Shiwen, and he was able to react in time. Whoosh! Suddenly, a pair of golden wings stretched open behind Yi Shiwen. What kind of wings were these? They had spread far and wide, and had blotted out the sky, like golden clouds. Everyone was stunned when they saw this scene. In fact, most people's first reaction was, Yi Shiwen is a devil. It was impossible for someone to bring out such terrifying wings. Only the devil race could do this. Many human experts could fly. But, flying was one thing, and using wings to fly was another. However, several people also noticed it was some kind of magical power. This pair of wings wasn't made of flesh. Rather, it was made up of energy. Moreover, this energy was rather intrepid, and could scare a person to death. What kind of magical ability is this? How can it be so frightening? These wings were sweeping out waves of golden divinities each time they flapped. And, those golden waves blotted out the sky, and covered the earth as they swept across. Moreover, wind and thunder erupted every time these huge wings flapped. It was like a precursor of a rainstorm's arrival. Yi Shiwen had already practiced his devil wings to an extremely profound level. Moreover, he had also touched upon the principle of flight since he had entered the semi-sage realm. An ordinary legendary expert couldn't contend against a semi-sage expert. It was impossible. And, the reason was that a semi-sage expert had touched upon the principles, and the principle of flight was also one of them. The agility skill of semi-sage realm was also at a very high level. Semi-sage experts could tread on the flight principle. So, a legendary expert simply couldn't match their speed. Yi Shiwen had managed to catch up with the speed of a semi-sage expert when he used to be in legendary realm, thanks to his devil wings. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to pull that off. He had also touched upon this principle after he had entered the semi-sage realm. His understanding of this flight principle had climbed up by a level some time later. He had then come to realize what a terrifying magical ability these devil wings were in reality. Just like Phoenix regeneration technique, the devil wings was also a magical technique that hadn't reached an advanced stage yet. It would be considered as an extremely powerful technique once it would be in its true form. It'd be genuinely difficult to deal with thereafter. In fact, Yi Xuan had been able to use it quite easily and freely even when he used to be weak. The only difference between now and then was in the magnitude of its might. Consequently, the devil wings would become more and more terrifying as his understanding of the principles deepened. Moreover, it had risen sharply. Yi Xuan's understanding of principles had burst forth significantly when he had entered the semi-sage realm after having condensed 1,000 Tao principles. And, this change had also reflected in his devil wings. Initially, his wings could only help him accelerate while he'd fly. However, his wings had also wielded the power of wind and thunder at this stage. His wings could even split an ordinary semi-sage expert into two halves as a result. This was the result of the understanding of wind and thunder. And, he had gained this understanding after having crossed the heavenly tribulation several times. He had then integrated his own comprehension of wind and thunder into the devil wings. In fact, this had been his first attempt to modify the devil wings by adding his own comprehension to them. Yi Xuan had undergone closed-door training in order to modify his devil wings after he had returned from the lair of the wind dragon. And, he had modified them a little bit in order to add some functions to them. However, it was an entirely new step for him. This clearly showed that his comprehension of the principles had reached an entirely new level. His previous understanding of principles hadn't even reached the end of the devil wing's functions, forget about the stage of modification. Devil wing was a magical ability that was already in its highest form. It had already reached perfection in a way. So, it was quite difficult to modify it. However, making slight modifications to it was comparatively easier. Even so, Yi Xuan had to use up more than 2 million primary spirit dawn for that. Yi Xuan looked like a devil god at this time. His devil wings were fluttering, and it seemed as if the clouds were thundering, and were letting him stay afloat in the sky. Flap, an enormous lightning fell from the sky. And, it compelled Emperor Chen and his golden lion to retreat. Crash bang. Yi Xuan's devil wings were flapping unceasingly, and were sweeping out wind and thunder. Then, the lightning began to seethe within this tempest. It then began to revolve around Yi Xuan. Soon, it seemed as if he was standing in an ocean of lightning. Emperor Chen's complexion had turned gloomy. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Xuan could be so tyrannical. The battle had become increasingly intense, and Yi Xuan had gradually started to reveal his hidden abilities. But, Emperor Chen hadn't anticipated this scenario earlier. Perhaps, he had never thought that Yi Xuan could be such a tough opponent. In fact, his mind still had the image of the Yi Xuan he had met on the Demon Island. He would have already fought with Yi Xuan, and would have already killed him if Qing Su hadn't interfered. He didn't feel anything different at the beginning of the competition. He wasn't afraid even though Yi Xuan had progressed rather quickly. He believed that he was the strongest. After all, he had the spatial ability. In fact, who would come forward to say that they were at the first if Emperor Chen were to say that he himself was at the second rank? He didn't possess the spatial ability himself, his golden lion did. However, what difference would it make? They had always been a team. Sure enough, everyone had suddenly become optimistic about him after he had displayed the spatial ability. The Xian Yuan twin stars were everyone's favorites for winning this competition at first. However, that had changed after his rise. In fact, they had become totally unworthy of a mention. However, he hadn't felt a shred of pride at this. This was inevitable in his opinion, this was a matter of fact. In fact, the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers were two pieces of trash in his opinion. He merely thought of Yi Xuan as a scourge that he hadn't been to get rid of earlier. He genuinely never considered Yi Xuan his rival. And, this had been his thought process until now. However, his thinking changed after he saw Yi Xuan's current avatar, and found out how dreadful he truly was. It was entirely different from the image of Yi Xuan he had in his mind from back then. He had no choice but to force himself to not get nervous, so that he could respond calmly. Flap. 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 Yishuan's huge golden wings were fluttering crazily. Wind and thunder were sweeping across like a rampaging dragon. It seemed as if a rainstorm was about to arrive. Endless thunderstorms gathered, and began to pour down towards Emperor Chen from above, just like raindrops. Bang! The wind and thunder pounded on that golden lion. It struck on its body, and charred a portion it. The golden lion didn't sustain serious injuries as a result of this attack. However, the force of the lightning had left its body a bit numb. It became sluggish for a short moment as a result of this. However, that short moment was enough for Yishuan. The wind and thunder were present everywhere in the sky. And they suddenly pounded on the golden lion upon Yishuan's command. Bang! 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 An endless rain of heavenly thunders poured upon the bodies of the golden lion and Emperor Chen. And the impact thereof had left them in a difficult situation. Chapter 459. These wind and thunder storms had arrived in a huge quantity. They weren't too powerful. However, the quantity was extremely huge. In fact, they seemed like a torrential downpour. The golden lion's speed was very high. It appeared like a golden lightning as it moved. However, the problem was that the scope of Yishuan's stretched devil wings was too broad. In fact, they were like two huge golden clouds. Emperor Chen and the golden lion were unable to get out of its range in such a short period of time as a result. So, they were forced in a somewhat difficult situation. They didn't sustain severe injuries. However, this had left them extremely depressed. Suddenly, two golden lights flashed. Yishuan finally opened his eyes. Then, a loud and sharp piercing schwa sound reverberated out of the blue, and he moved into action. And he disappeared in front of everyone's sight as a result. People suddenly lost sight of Yishuan as soon as this scene blossomed before their eyes. They had to condense their real elemental energy in their eyes to enhance their vision. However, they were barely able to see his afterimage even then. Bang! Yishuan pressed down his palm. It pounded upon Emperor Chen, but it seemed as if a mountain was smashing down from the sky. Rumble. Emperor Chen's movement wasn't slow either. In fact, he was even quicker than the golden lion. He promptly turned around, and shot his lance upward to face the incoming attack. Bang! Yishuan's palm and Emperor Chen's lance collided. The sound of the collision of metals sounded. Everyone was so scared upon witnessing this scene that they almost fell down from their seats. Everyone knew that Emperor Chen's lance was a sage tool. In fact, it was strong enough to pierce the void. It was exceptionally terrifying. It could even stab a sage expert to death. However, a sound of collision between iron and gold had resounded when it collided with Yishuan's palm. This indicated that Yishuan's body was intrepid to the point of exaggeration. He had failed to break this lance into pieces, but his flesh had still managed to counterbalance the incredible might of this sage tool. Such kind of a body was intrepid beyond any limits. He possessed such kind of a body. How could anybody be his opponent? Speed, strength, and physical toughness, he had perfected these attributes to the peak. It was sufficient to place him at the top among his peers. After all, Emperor Chen was ranked at the top because of his spatial ability. Moreover, everyone had also witnessed Yishuan's incredible speed. They could only see his figure on occasions even though they had enhanced their visions. Moreover, his physical toughness was so tyrannical that it had left them stunned. After all, his body could be compared with a sage tool. He had clashed head-on with a sage tool. Such bodily strength had left everyone in awe. Moreover, it was of pivotal importance to note that he also possessed insane strength. His attack had barely touched Emperor Chen's body, but the man's arm was still left to tremble from the shock. It was evident that this attack had left a decent effect on him. It could be said that Yishuan's slap would have broken all the bones in the body of an average person, and would have left the said person unable to stand up. Many people realized that Emperor Chen's body was also extremely tyrannical. They hadn't realized it earlier. They were only attracted to his spatial ability before. His spatial ability had obscured everything else. However, one couldn't blame the others since he himself was dazzled by this spatial ability alone. He felt that many of his own characteristics and skills had become insignificant in front of this spatial ability. Everyone else seemed to think so as well. It wasn't that they thought that he didn't possess any other skill. However, his spatial ability was too amazing. However, his collision with Yishuan had made them realize that his body was also extremely tyrannical. One must keep in mind that Yishuan had defeated the barbarian god's real body, Qi Tian, at a lightning speed. This fight had confused them even more. After all, both of the individuals were insanely powerful. What kind of magical power is this? An extreme greedy look flashed in the eyes of the lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall when he saw Yishuan's huge wings. His high cultivation level had allowed him to read Yishuan's movements rather clearly. He had surpassed the great sage realm. So, ordinary magical powers and martial art techniques were unlikely to attract his attention. However, Yishuan's devil wings had made him excited. He could tell that Yishuan's magical power was truly outstanding. In fact, it had increased Yishuan's speed to such a terrifying extent that many sage experts couldn't match his current speed. Fortunately, his opponent was a tyrannical expert like Emperor Chen. He also possessed extremely fast speed. Otherwise, it would have been a child's play for Yishuan to kill an ordinary person at his current speed. Therefore, this lord's speed would also advance by leaps and bounds if he could get hold of this magical power. Even his strength would increase enormously if that were to happen. The Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave was keeping a close eye on Yishuan's body. Several people had been stunned when they had seen how Yishuan had tackled the sage tool. Even an expert like him was no exception despite the fact that he had surpassed the great sage realm. And that's because he had come to realize that Yishuan's body was probably more tyrannical than the barbarian god's real body. Moreover, it wasn't a question of the disparity in martial power. He knew that one couldn't possibly clash with a sage tool whilst still being at semi-sage realm. In fact, even the most frightening barbarian god's real body couldn't achieve this feat. Someone had once tried to break a sage tool with bare hands after they had become a sage expert. However, that had happened a long time ago. He had always taken that to be a mere legend. However, he had come to realize that there's always someone out there who's better. Similarly, Yishuan's cultivated body was probably more tyrannical than the barbarian god's real body. He got very excited as he realized this. One must know that these southern barbarian forces had risen to influence by relying on their strong physiques. And, the possession of such an extremely powerful body meant that Yishuan must also possess some kind of a secret body technique. And, this had attracted his attention far more than the devil wings ever could. He might rise above all others in the ensuing war among southern barbarian forces if he could obtain such a body. One needed to pay a huge price to cultivate the barbarian god's real body. Moreover, one would also require the flaming sun real water. But, it seemed like Yishuan must have faced far lesser difficulties. After all, it was evident that Yishuan had cultivated his body to such an extent on his own. And, that trace of astonishment on the face of the Supreme Lord of the True Martial University had made this fact overly obvious. This meant that even he didn't know anything about Yishuan's physique. Therefore, Yishuan must have cultivated this physique on his own. Yishuan had cultivated such a physique alone. So, this lord would be able to nurture several people with physiques like Yishuan's if he were to put the entire resources of the Fire Cloud Cave into cultivating physiques. And, that would easily make up for the loss of Qi Tian's talent. Both these individuals had revealed their hidden abilities in this fight. For example, Emperor Chen's tyrannical body had unexpectedly got exposed. In addition, Yishuan had never revealed such incredible speed and astonishing magical abilities in the past. Even the people of their own sects didn't know that they possessed such abilities. It's instinctual for people to keep their secret abilities hidden, until they are forced to reveal. Their opponents hadn't been able to compel them to display their full potential so far. Perhaps it could be said that they didn't feel the need to use their hidden powers. However, they had unleashed their powers without any hesitation in the face of tyrannical experts like each other. Bang! 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 Yi Shiwen was extremely fast. He appeared like a golden flash to the eyes of the spectators. In fact, his speed would increase beyond unimaginable proportions whenever he'd flap his huge wings. He continued to attack Emperor Chen in order to kill him. It seemed as if every palm attack of his could break the heavens. Emperor Chen didn't get the time to breathe in the face of Yi Shiwen's quick and heavy attacks. In fact, it could be said that he had become tired of running for his life to no end. It wasn't that Emperor Chen wasn't enough tyrannical. Rather, Yi Shiwen was far too powerful. Everyone felt that everything about Yi Shiwen had become tyrannical to an astonishing level, whether it was his strength, speed, or physical toughness. He could kill a Heaven's Pride expert in one slap with such tyrannical body. He wouldn't even need to use his real elemental energy for that. Yi Shiwen's speed had reached the extreme after he had launched the devil wings. In fact, the speed of lightning wasn't enough to describe his current speed. An average person couldn't even see him. In fact, even Emperor Chen could barely see him. He could somehow keep up, but that too with great difficulty. Emperor Chen was able to react. However, he couldn't match Yi Shiwen's speed. Therefore, he had no option but to watch as Yi Shiwen assumed complete the control. He had no way to counter Yi Shiwen's attacks. His body wasn't strong enough to contend against Yi Shiwen head-on. It was only strong enough to prevent itself from getting smashed in a moment's time. The spectators with discerning eyes could see that Yi Shiwen would kill Emperor Chen if the fight continued like this. Yi Shiwen is extremely ferocious. Who could have thought that he would possess such abilities? Whether it's speed, strength, or body, it seems that he has grasped all the magical power techniques. And, these techniques are extremely difficult to understand in reality. How can he be so ferocious? How many adventures has he been on? Yeah. Even I was very optimistic about Emperor Chen earlier. After all, he possesses the spatial ability. However, I didn't expect that things would turn out like this. Yi Shiwen has completely suppressed him under his attacks. Emperor Chen is no match for him. Such strength was extremely tyrannical. It was too scary. Many believed that Emperor Chen's strength was also extremely tyrannical, and had no limits. In fact, his body and speed were both high-handed. Qin Wang didn't have any power to fight back when he had faced the repeated offensives, and he had gotten killed in the end. Therefore, Emperor Chen could be ranked at the top of the younger generation. However, such an expert had been suppressed by Yi Shiwen. In fact, the man didn't even have the power to fight back. That's quite normal. Emperor Chen possesses tyrannical strength. However, he was mainly depending on his spatial ability. And, that's the reason why he hadn't revealed his true strength in the past. It doesn't matter how tyrannical Yi Shiwen is, he wouldn't have been able to match Emperor Chen's speed if Emperor Chen had revealed his spatial ability inside the microcosm. In fact, Emperor Chen wouldn't have been the one getting suppressed at this moment if that had come to happen. Rather, Yi Shiwen would have been the one getting suppressed. And, Yi Shiwen's tyrannical strength would have been of no use if that scenario had unfolded. Damn it! How can this Yi Shiwen be so lucky? This is simply despicable. Yi Shiwen would have been like a feather in front of Emperor Chen's spatial ability if the space of the metropolis Martial Peak wasn't so strongly strengthened. A disciple of Muddy Sky Island complained in a rather unreconciled manner. Chapter 460. The disciples of the other forces became somewhat speechless. They looked at this disciple of the Muddy Sky Island. Emperor Chen's superiority wasn't enough for him because the environment had suddenly become unfavorable for him. The situation was the same for the both of them. Emperor Chen had been restricted. However, it wasn't as if Yishuan hadn't been restricted. He too couldn't attack extravagantly. However, everyone had no choice but to admit that this situation was too advantageous for Yishuan. The restrictions had been imposed on both of them. But, Emperor Chen's spatial ability had been restricted. There was also a restriction on Yishuan, but it wasn't very evident. This hadn't been seen as that overwhelming of a change in the beginning. However, nobody had anticipated that Yishuan would possess such terrifying magical power, and that his speed would increase to the pinnacle. And, that too at a time when Emperor Chen's speed had been restricted to a great degree. Yishuan's speed had increased significantly. Therefore, the restrictions of this space had turned out to be a good thing for Yishuan. Lucky? Is this merely just good luck? A true Martial University's disciple spoke up with disdain. Didn't you pay attention to Yishuan's wisdom in battle? He didn't give the Twin Stars brothers any chance to collaborate when he had fought them. And, he eventually stunned everyone by killing them quickly. Therefore, the contest which was supposed to be a bitter struggle transformed into a one-sided battle. And, he has shattered the microcosm this time. Is it a case of Yishuan's good luck or Emperor Chen's bad luck? Is it that simple? Can it be possible that Yishuan might have planned to drag him to the metropolis martial peak for the real fight? This true Martial University disciple had spoken of another possibility. Everyone held their breath as they heard this. Yishuan's planning ability had transcended everyone's imagination if this disciple was correct. He had thought of a good way to deal with the adverse situation in the midst of this fast-paced battle. He had transformed an unfavorable situation into a favorable one as a result. And, he would be considered dreadful if he had pre-planned this. Who could match such battle wisdom? Of course, they didn't know that the restricted space had also affected Yishuan. The principle of flight employed by his devil wings was very different from that of a bird's principle of flight. He must manipulate the principle of flight, but he must also do the same with the principle of space. The principle of space was also a very important part. He couldn't possibly maneuver around at such speeds in the air without manipulating the principle of space. The restriction on the spatial ability had turned out to be a big disaster for Emperor Chen. However, it didn't cause a small effect on Yishuan either. Yishuan had planned to go all out while he'd compete against Emperor Chen. The opposite party could teleport away in a flash, but Yishuan had his plans to deal with him. However, it suddenly seemed as if his plans weren't needed. It had become a lot easier to surround and kill Emperor Chen in this scenario. He didn't care whether it was fair or unfair to Emperor Chen. He didn't think about these things. Only an idiot would think about fair and unfair things in the middle of a battle. A lot of things in this world were unfair. For example, Emperor Chen had challenged him to a fight without considering the fact that he had fought against the Twin Stars brother a moment ago. Emperor Chen had forced him to fight without caring about whether it was fair or unfair. So, he could go to hell if he wanted to complain about the unfairness of the situation. Yishuan's eyes were only fixed on Emperor Chen at the moment. He wanted to kill Emperor Chen. He believed that Emperor Chen wouldn't have let go of a chance such as this to kill him. Inverting Ocean Seal. Yishuan's shout gave rise to a sonic boom. Suddenly, endless water drops appeared in the sky behind Emperor Chen. The water droplets condensed into a vast ocean-like blue seal, and pounded towards Emperor Chen. Bang! Emperor Chen didn't get the time to react. And, this attack pounded on his body. His hands had already become numb after having fought for so long. They weren't as flexible as before. They had been rendered lifeless by the shocks caused by Yishuan's attacks during the course of fight. Emperor Chen's armor got shattered into small pieces. This water-based attack had seemed feeble at first, but it had condensed to form an extremely mighty attack. It had broken his armor, and it had also badly injured his body. His flesh had been ruptured, and blood had started to splash out. His bones had also been exposed. In fact, he had nearly been crushed to death by Yishuan. What? Emperor Chen has sustained injuries? Everyone was startled. Emperor Chen had been suppressed and forced into a disadvantageous position by Yishuan. However, being suppressed and sustaining injuries were completely different things. He had merely been suppressed by Yi Shiwen until this moment. However, he still had enough strength to hold his own. But, he had now sustained injuries. Such deep injuries indicated vulnerability, and the beginning of an inevitable defeat. That's because these injuries would affect Emperor Chen's ability to react. The regeneration pace of Yi Shiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique was extremely fast. However, it still required some time to heal the injuries in moments of vulnerability times. Yi Shiwen would inevitably have his weak moments in the future. His Phoenix regeneration technique would certainly shorten his vulnerable moments to the minimum. However, that short period of time would be enough for some top-tier expert to give a decisive blow to him. However, Emperor Chen's secret healing technique wasn't as good as Yi Shiwen's. Therefore, this time period was enough for Yi Shiwen to gain an upper hand, and give him a fatal blow. Emperor Chen, there is nothing left for you to say. It's time for your death. I will send you on your way to the afterlife. Yi Shiwen laughed and spoke. He couldn't help but laugh out loud when he saw that his biggest enemy was about to die at his hands. He had burst into laughter because of this strange and carefree feeling. In fact, he was dripping with delight. He suddenly had an illusion, he felt as if he was going to make a breakthrough. People are often unable to make breakthroughs. This isn't limited to the fact that the accumulation of energy isn't enough. Instead, it's mainly because of the shackles on their spirits. This is the so-called case of the dilemma of the person who has his will shattered by someone. And, this shackles that person's spirit. These shackles are usually invisible, but they appear when the said person confronts that someone again. And, these invisible shackles strongly bind the said person when that happens. Yi Shiwen had been afraid of Emperor Chen since that time on the Demon Island. And, his spirit had been shackled by the invisible shackles of Emperor Chen ever since. Generally, it's quite difficult for people to perceive these shackles. However, it is extremely dangerous. It can even evolve into the inner demons within one's heart, and might also obstruct one's cultivation thereafter. However, such shackles were also good since having inner demons was considered a good thing, but only as long as one was capable of eradicating them in the future. One would then have a broad view of the world, but only as long as these shackles had been obliterated. They would get the same feeling that a blindfolded person gets when their blindfold is suddenly removed from over their eyes. Yi Shiwen perceived the same kind of feeling at this moment. His cultivation hadn't made a breakthrough for a long time. But, he could faintly feel the signs of making a breakthrough at this moment. It was true that the quickest way to make a breakthrough was during a combat. Yi Shiwen was laughing loudly, but he had become even more cautious. The closer one reaches to victory, the more one needs to be cautious. He wouldn't wish to lose the upper hand and suffer an unexpected defeat in the end. Such experience would be too hard to bear. An inverting ocean seal condensed on top of Yi Shiwen's hand, and swept down towards Emperor Chen and the Golden Lion. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it pounded upon them. It seemed as if this attack would kill Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen and the Golden Lion were sent flying by the attack. However, they also got the opportunity to get away from Yi Shiwen's attack range. They finally got the time to respite as a result. Roar! The Golden Lion roared loudly. It opened its mouth like a sacrificial bowl. A seemingly endless amount of energy fluctuated inside its mouth. It transformed into a huge golden beam of light, and shot towards Yi Shiwen. Then, it collided with the inverting ocean seal. Rumble! The collision emitted dazzling rays of light, and formed a ball of energy that exploded into a giant mushroom cloud. This mushroom cloud then rose up from the place of the collision. This collision was like an atomic eruption, and had crushed the surrounding ground into fine powder. That beam of light had gotten crushed between the ground and Yi Shiwen's inverting ocean seal, and had burst into golden rays of light that had filled the entire sky. However, the seal had continued to sweep down from above. Rumble! It pounded on the public square and smashed open a massive crater. The spectators couldn't help but gasp. The space on top of the metropolis Marshall Peak had been strengthened countless times. In other words, everything within the confines of this peak must have been strengthened several times. Moreover, that the public square was made up of solid jade stone. It had also been protected with top-tier barrier formations. However, Yishuan's inverting ocean seal had opened a huge crater in it. The terrifying might of the inverting ocean seal was clearly visible. A person probably wouldn't survive this attack, even if he were to have 9 lives to achieve this feat. This seal technique was absolutely dreadful. They had never seen such a terrifying seal technique. It seemed as if a god had imparted this technique. Everyone understood what kind of attack Emperor Chen had just faced. Even a top expert like him didn't have the power to fight back when faced with Yishuan's attack, since he was battered and exhausted. So, he didn't have any way out. It wasn't that Emperor Chen was too weak. Rather, Yishuan was far too powerful. Where's Emperor Chen? Smoke and dust had scattered. Sharp-sighted people tried, but couldn't spot Emperor Chen. It seemed as if he had disappeared into thin air. Yishuan's attack was very terrifying. However, it couldn't have annihilated Emperor Chen on an atomic level after having struck him. The remains of his body must have remained still. However, they couldn't see any trace of him at the moment. Even his golden lion had disappeared without a trace. Yishuan felt that his attack hadn't actually hit Emperor Chen. In fact, he had clearly felt a spatial fluctuation, and had felt that Emperor Chen had teleported away. How's this possible? He can use his teleportation ability here as well. Yishuan was kind of terrified in his heart. He didn't know how Emperor Chen had escaped. Had he been able to use his spatial ability even in this situation? However, Yishuan had become even more vigilant because Emperor Chen might appear at any place if he could use his spatial ability here. And, this was extremely dangerous for Yishuan. Yishuan condensed his real elemental energy in his eyes, and opened his discernment vision. He was paying absolute attention to spot any fluctuations in the surrounding space. He had also swept out his divine sense. So, he was prepared to sense Emperor Chen's presence anywhere and anytime. Yishuan, it's over now, an ice-cold and merciless voice resounded. Chapter 461. Yishuan, it's over now, an ice-cold voice said in a ruthless manner as a figure suddenly appeared behind Yishuan. Emperor Chen was seated upright on the golden lion. His lance pierced the vast sky like a dragon. It issued a shrill piercing sound as it swept towards Yishuan's back, and it seemed as if it would pierce his heart. Emperor Chen's body didn't look in a miserable condition anymore. It was evident that his injuries had recovered in this short period of time. Yishuan had never thought that he would accidentally obtain a secret technique such as the Phoenix Regeneration Technique. Similarly, his opponent had also had his own share of adventures. So, he must also have obtained an extremely marvelous healing technique, even if it wasn't as good as the Phoenix Regeneration Technique. This was bad for Yishuan in this situation. Who would be able to kill Emperor Chen if he could go into hiding to heal his injuries? In fact, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that he was almost standing at the position of invincibility because of his spatial ability. He was very troublesome. The spatial ability was possessed by the golden lion, not him. However, what difference would it make? Yishuan had racked his brain to come up with a strategy in order to drag Emperor Chen to the public square of the metropolis Marshall Peak. Wasn't had meant to restrict Emperor Chen's spatial ability. That's correct. The fact is that breaking the microcosm was also one of his strategies. Otherwise, Yishuan would have been in an extremely disadvantageous situation in front of an opponent like Emperor Chen who possessed the spatial ability. Yishuan could also shuttle back and forth in the space if his devil wings had been perfected to the top layer. However, that was a matter for the future. Yishuan wanted to practice the devil wings to such an extent that he could break through the bindings of space at will. However, he still had to go a long way to achieve that. He didn't have any way to deal with Emperor Chen's spatial ability at the moment. Restricting Emperor Chen's spatial ability was very necessary for him because this fight might turn into a bitter struggle if he couldn't do that. He was confident that Emperor Chen couldn't kill him. Therefore, it would become an extremely long confrontation if he couldn't kill Emperor Chen either. He didn't wish for this to happen. He believed that Emperor Chen must be thinking of killing him. So, why mustn't he try to kill Emperor Chen as well? Therefore, he must think of a method to kill Emperor Chen. Only then would he be at ease. Yi Shiwen had planned how he would face Emperor Chen before this unexpected fight had begun. He had never looked down on his opponent, unlike Emperor Chen had. In fact, Yi Shiwen hadn't taken him lightly. Relatively speaking, he was more wary of Emperor Chen than Emperor Chen was of him. Emperor Chen had never looked him eye to eye before this battle. He had always looked down on Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen considered Emperor Chen as his biggest enemy in the present generation. And, his valuation of Emperor Chen had increased further when Emperor Chen had revealed the spatial ability. Yi Shiwen had thought of many ways to restrict Emperor Chen's spatial ability. However, he couldn't find any concrete method. After all, he wasn't a great sage expert. The great sage experts could reinforce the surrounding space to stop the enemy from coming closer to them. So, Yi Shiwen eventually thought of a method, and dragged Emperor Chen to the public square of the metropolis Martial Peak. The conflagration of this battle had been brought down to the main world. Things would become extremely simple for Yi Shiwen if he could restrict Emperor Chen's spatial ability. Then, even the tyrannical Emperor Chen wouldn't be a match for him. Everything so far had happened as per his expectations. Emperor Chen had become like a crippled person. One could say that one of his arms had been broken since his spatial ability had been restricted. He could only resist Yi Shiwen's attacks as a result. However, he didn't have the power to fight back. And, he wasn't a match for Yi Shiwen when it came to real strength. Yi Shiwen had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Emperor Chen wasn't far behind him, but there was a difference of heaven and earth between their strengths. Yi Shiwen had reached perfection in the semi-sage realm. However, things that happened afterwards had gone beyond his expectation. Emperor Chen has appeared, someone shouted in alarm. It seemed as if this person had already seen Yi Shiwen getting hit in advance, and blood had already splashed out of his body thereafter. Emperor Chen's sudden appearance, after having disappeared suddenly a while ago, had stunned everyone. He could travel back and forth in the space of the metropolis Martial Peak. This ability was far too terrifying. Yi Shiwen is screwed. Nobody can be a match for our Emperor Chen since he has regained his spatial ability. Yi Shiwen is nothing more than a trash before him as matters stand. A Muddy Sky Island's disciple burst into laughter and spoke. They had become quite depressed when they had seen Yi Shiwen unceasingly suppress Emperor Chen. However, they suddenly burst into laughter as they saw Emperor Chen's counterattack. Clang! A loud sound of the collision of iron and gold metal resounded along with an explosion. But, blood hadn't splashed out of Yi Shiwen's body as everyone had previously imagined. Rather, he had avoided danger at the most crucial moment with a sudden thrust of his palm. His palm transformed into a huge dragon claw, and went up to face that sage-level lance. Rumble. The collision between the two sides had seemed like the collision between two megastars. It was the kind of clash that would leave both sides shattered. A huge explosion occurred along with the emission of boundless rays of light. Endless blast waves and energy storms swept out in all directions. Everything in a vast range had been annihilated by this blast, even the air wasn't an exception to this. It was an extremely dreadful scene. Clang! Suddenly, a sword's cry resounded. A huge long sword suddenly appeared in Yi Shiwen's hand. The sword energy soared in the sky. It swept across boundless divine beams, and suddenly pounded towards Emperor Chen to chop him. Bang! This long sword cut apart that boundless storm, and struck Emperor Chen. Poof! Blood splashed out from Emperor Chen's body, and rose 300 feet in the air. He snorted painfully, and disappeared before everyone's eyes. Everyone had been holding their breath since the moment Emperor Chen had appeared. And they finally let out their breath when they saw Emperor Chen disappear again. The sounds of inhaling and exhaling resounded everywhere as a result. Everything had been said long ago. However, all this had happened in a flash. Everyone had held their breath the moment Emperor Chen had suddenly appeared. This was because they had anticipated that Emperor Chen would pierce Yi Shiwen's heart and insta-kill Yi Shiwen, just like he had done with Qin Wang. After all, Qin Wang's strength wasn't bad either. However, he had been defeated instantly. Emperor Chen hadn't spent a bit of his strength, but had managed to defeat him in a moment. And this had left a deep impression in everyone's heart. Therefore, everyone had thought that Yi Shiwen would be defeated as soon as Emperor Chen would demonstrate his spatial ability. Yi Shiwen had also showed tyrannical strength, but nobody was optimistic about him when it came to fighting with Emperor Chen. However, everybody realized that Yi Shiwen was too tyrannical once the real fight started. And his speed was extremely high. This fact was even more important. He obviously didn't have the means to prevent Emperor Chen's spatial ability. However, he was fast enough to ensure that he could retaliate before he got hit by Emperor Chen's surprise attacks. Yi Shiwen might not be able to land a fatal blow on him. However, this passive fighting style would also be quite effective. It turned out that Emperor Chen had sustained injuries as a result of this attack. Everyone was dumbstruck. They didn't expect that Yi Shiwen would injure Emperor Chen even though he had revealed the spatial ability. This outcome is beyond everyone's imagination. Who would have guessed that this would come to happen? Someone exclaimed. Yeah. It's an extremely thrilling fight. It's changing its course every now and then. Everyone had thought that Emperor Chen would gain upper hand since the start. However, he fell into Yi Shiwen's trap, and has been forced into a disadvantageous position. Yi Shiwen has played him quite miserably, someone acknowledged. Emperor Chen would have been thoroughly defeated by Yi Shiwen if he hadn't displayed his spatial ability at the last moment. After all, Yi Shiwen had displayed an extremely terrifying combat strength. Nobody had thought that Emperor Chen wouldn't be able to suppress Yi Shiwen even after he had displayed his spatial ability. Moreover, they had never anticipated that Yi Shiwen would still be the first one to land a blow and injure Emperor Chen again. This outcome had left everyone in shock. In fact, they simply couldn't accept it. This Yi Shiwen is far too powerful. Even a guy like Emperor Chen can't suppress him with his spatial ability, someone spoke up. Yi Shiwen is far too strong. Look at his wings. I don't know what kind of magical ability this is. But his wings are too terrifying, and ridiculously fast. Isn't it some kind of an ancient magical ability? This Yi Shiwen is very lucky. Someone had guessed how many magical abilities Yi Shiwen must have obtained to turn so ridiculously strong. This person obviously became very envious. A person could be on their way to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert if they could obtain even one of the magical abilities that Yi Shiwen possessed. Not to mention that so many of these magical abilities had concentrated together in the hands of one person. So, it wasn't surprising that Yi Shiwen had become so strong. Yi Shiwen didn't relax after he injured Emperor Chen. He knew that Emperor Chen was hiding within the space, and was waiting for his injuries to heal. However, knowing this was also useless. Everyone knew this, but this knowledge was still useless. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen would tear the space, and burst into the subspace. However, that would result in his body getting torn into pieces by the chaos energy. Even the great sage experts wouldn't dare to do that because the chaos energy was too frightening. The rumors suggested that the chaos energy was the mother energy of everything. In other words, all things in the 10,000 worlds had evolved out from the chaos energy. An Almighty had created this universe in the chaos. And this universe had come to be known as 10,000 worlds. This explains how the chaos energy had become incredibly famous as the mother energy of everything, and how tyrannical this energy was in reality. A person could only walk inside it unhampered, but only if they possessed tyrannical strength. However, it would a dead end for a person of Yi Shiwen's strength if he were to dare to go in. In fact, he would die instantly, and his body would be reduced to dust. However, people who possessed spatial ability could freely travel back and forth in the chaos. Of course, this was because they had an innate affinity for space. So, the power of space would protect them from getting eroded by the chaos. Some special physiques could also move in the chaos freely. However, the people with such special physiques were very rare, and had natural affinity for chaos energy since birth. They could even command the chaos energy to attack when they faced a powerful opponent. And, the lower the opponent's cultivation, the scarier it would get for them. That's because the people with lower cultivation held lesser resistance towards chaos energy. So, this scenario was very dreadful for them. Yi Shiwen knew how dreadful the chaos energy was. So, he didn't dare to approach it, even though he possessed the gilded tyrant form. Chapter 462. He wasn't afraid of being infected by small amounts of chaos energy. However, he would die if he were to burst into the chaos. Therefore, he must be extremely cautious. Emperor Chen might appear at any time. And, Emperor would have recovered to his peak condition by the time he would reappear. So, he would give a fatal blow as soon as he would reappear. Therefore, this fight would drag on indefinitely if Yi Shiwen couldn't kill Emperor Chen sooner. This may turn into a long protracted fight, one of the spectators observed. Yi Shiwen can't stay this vigilant for a long time. And, Emperor Chen can't continue like this either. He can't remain hidden inside the chaos for very long. Emperor Chen could escape inside the subspace since he possessed the spatial ability. However, he couldn't do it for very long unless he was a devil god who had lived in the chaos during the chaos era. Those who had bathed in the sacred lake a few times could also achieve this feat. However, only these aforementioned people could stay longer in the chaos than those with spatial ability. Whoosh! Emperor Chen reappeared on the right side of Yi Shiwen. He looked somewhat fierce. A murderous look flashed in his eyes. He brandished his lance, and it released endless divine beams. They beams swept across the sky. They then crashed down like a huge star. This spectacle looked extremely terrifying. Blood-red rays of light erupted from the body of the golden lion. The skin on his body had begun to crack slightly. In fact, veins had started to pop out of its flesh. Its face had turned extremely grim. It seemed as if it was enduring unbearable pain. Rumble. The lance issued boundless aura. It seemed as if a god had raised his lance. Emperor Chen's aura had restored to its peak state. Rumble. Yi Shiwen raised his long sword to welcome the incoming attack. The long sword collided with the lance, and set off boundless energy storms. The white jade stage under their feet gradually began to disintegrate. An endless amount of debris was flung around as a result, and the surrounding air curved and distorted. Everyone became terrified when they saw this scene. The bodies of the disciples of younger generation had turned ice cold. These two individuals possessed very formidable strength. Who could contend against them in such a bloody battle of life and death? Both of them were extremely intrepid. And, everyone was scared to see them. Everyone compared themselves with these two individuals, but they felt that their bodies had turned cold. In fact, it was a hair-raising feeling of terror. Yi Shiwen condensed a seal attack. And, the inverting ocean seal poured down towards Emperor Chen to crush him. Yi Shiwen had used the same old formidable attacks. Buried sword secrets, the inverting ocean seal, these were very frightening martial arts. Each of them could scare a person to death. And, these attacks had unleashed an incredible power in the hands of Yi Shiwen at this time. Buried sword secrets could bury anything, the heaven included. So, what was a mere human being? It could bury the heaven, bury the earth, bury a person, and bury all mortal creatures once it had been practiced to the peak. One sword strike could eliminate all living things in its path. It looked like an ordinary sword attack that didn't carry an outstanding, imposing aura. However, it had broken Emperor Chen's defense with an irresistible force. The inverting ocean seal smashed down as well. It was a dreadful seal technique. The inverting ocean seal and Han seal were completely different. The Han seal contained brute force. So, it would carry irresistible force while it would smash down on someone. However, the inverting ocean seal was different from the Han seal. It was gentle like seawater. It was kind and soft like the steady flow of water. However, it was also inwardly sinister, and could bring about a destructive flood. So, it was a much more profound attack when compared to the Han seal. It coupled strength and gentleness. The dreadful great seal smashed down. It appeared as if a boundless ocean had been overturned. The steadiness of this attack was very scary. Emperor Chen raised his lance to resist. However, he felt an unimaginable force being transferred into his hand through his lance. His hand almost broke off. The muscles in his hand exploded and spattered along with his blood. Everyone got scared when they saw this. Emperor Chen had already tasted loss once. So, he couldn't possibly repeat the same mistake again. He dodged sideways to avoid the attack. Then, he transformed into a yellow light, and disappeared inside the space. Yi Shiwen wasn't worried this time. He revealed faint a smile on his face. On the contrary. He had finally found his opponent's weakness. The golden lion had already overused its ability. So, its body would collapse very soon as a result. Traveling back and forth in the space in the restricted space of the Metropolis Marshall Peak must have been a very strenuous task for the golden lion despite the fact that it possessed the spatial ability. In fact, it must have pushed itself to perform these sneak attacks. It's not good. I'm afraid that Emperor Chen may not be able to last long at this rate. Yi Shiwen possesses a very sharp eyesight. Many sage-level core disciples were present among the spectators. Everyone knew what level of people they were. They could clearly see that Emperor Chen had been forced into a corner. In fact, he might not be able to use the spatial ability for long. In other words, he would be the one to collapse if he couldn't kill Yi Shiwen soon. And, it would be of no use even if he were to escape into the space, because he would be torn apart by the chaos once the golden lion were to perish. He was running out of time as the matter stood. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island had already become nervous atop the tall platform. He wasn't nervous at first since he was very confident about Emperor Chen. He believed that Emperor Chen would defeat Yi Shiwen. However, he realized that he was overconfident about Emperor Chen after having watched the fight. Yi Shiwen's tyranny had gone far beyond his imagination. It's impossible. Emperor Chen has condensed 999 Tao principles. And, each of these principles is at least 10 times thicker than that of an ordinary person. He can be considered at the peak in the younger generation with such strength. One doesn't even need to include the spatial ability in this equation. Then, why does he seem so vulnerable in front? Yi Shiwen, the Lord of the Muddy Sky Island, exclaimed in disbelief. He had confidence on Emperor Chen at the start of the fight. However, that confidence hadn't sources from his spatial ability alone. Emperor Chen's spatial ability was his hidden trump card. He had never revealed this ability before. Therefore, even the Lord of this island didn't know about this. The reason behind such confidence was Emperor Chen's inherent tyrannical strength. He had condensed 999 Tao principles. And, each of these principles was at least 10 times thicker than that of an ordinary person. Therefore, calling him invincible in the semi-sage realm wouldn't be an overstatement. This was the main reason behind the Lord's confidence. Even someone who had the same strength as Emperor Chen wouldn't be able to prevail over him. It'd be a tie at the most. However, Emperor Chen looked very vulnerable in front of Yi Shiwen. What was going on? What the hell is this? What's going on? Everyone was perplexed, especially the disciples of the Muddy Sky Island. They had seen Emperor Chen's might in the past. Moreover, Emperor Chen hadn't even revealed the spatial ability back then. However, he had defeated each of his opponents, and had earned himself the title of the undisputed King of East Sea. He had achieved that by relying on his invincible strength alone, nothing else. That fight between him and Qin Wang had been very devastating. However, everyone believed that Emperor Chen would kill Qin Wang even if they would engage in a bitter struggle. Both of them had condensed 999 Tao principles. However, if Qin Wang was elite among elites, then Emperor Chen was the king of kings. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't used some shameful tricks. He had suppressed Emperor Chen's counterattack by depending on his own strength. And, such strength was truly dreadful. Such intrepid strength didn't look like that of a semi-sage expert. In fact, it seemed as if Emperor Chen was fighting against a sage expert since he didn't have enough power to fight back. Has Yi Shiwen reached the sage realm? A bold disciple speculated. That's impossible. Yi Shiwen doesn't possess the unique aura of a sage expert. He's still in the semi-sage realm. He hasn't entered the sage realm yet. A sage-level core disciple shook his head and replied. The sage experts were very susceptible towards the unique aura of the sage realm. Therefore, a sage expert couldn't conceal his strength from another sage expert even if he had suppressed his true power. It's like, an adult can't become a child no matter how much they pretend to be one. An adult will always look like an adult even if one would chop their legs and shorten their height to make it equivalent to that of a child. The semi-sage experts used preliminary principles. However, the principles of the semi-sage experts were disordered and unorganized. There was no connection between each principle. However, this wasn't the case with sage experts. The principles of the sage experts were scattered, but not unorganized. A mysterious and inexorable force kept the magical symbols of these principles bound together. And, these principles would come into play together as soon as an attack was launched by a sage expert. It would carry endless might compared to a semi-sage expert's attack since the principles would act one at a time in the case of the latter. And, this difference was even greater than the one between cloud and mud. However, Yi Shiwen's principles didn't appear to be bounded together. They still looked somewhat unorganized and disordered. So how's this possible? Someone asked doubtfully. How could Yi Shiwen be so powerful? Yi Shiwen knew that Emperor Chen had escaped into the subspace. He also knew that he could slowly push Emperor Chen towards his death by passing time. However, he couldn't become careless with it, and he couldn't delay too much. Therefore, Yi Shiwen finally decided against concealing his true power. Thus, his principles began to soar into the sky one after another. Then, they began to twine around him. 900, 997. 998, 999. 1000. What? How's this possible? Yi Shiwen's principles soared into the sky, and began to revolve around him. Someone counted the number of principles on his body, but the count reached 1000 Tao principles. That person thought that he must have made some mistake. So, he counted again. However, he still found out the count to be at 1000 Tao principles. The gasping sound started to resound one after another. Everyone believed that 999 Tao principles was the absolute upper limit in the semi-sage realm for a human expert. However, Yi Shiwen had condensed 1000 Tao principles. This had gone beyond everyone's imagination. How's this possible? Everyone was shocked. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island stood up from his seat. Little to nothing could have moved him this much when one take his cultivation into consideration. However, he had been frightened to such an extent that he had jumped up from his seat. He actually has 1000. The Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall also saw this scene. A strong murderous intention flickered in his eyes, apart from the obviously shocked look. This is the so-called matter of something so abnormal can only be a demon's doing. But, this evil genius isn't even one of my subordinates. So, I will have to find a way to eradicate him. An unfathomable, killing intention flashed in the eyes of the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave, the Lord of Muddy Sky Island, and the other experts of the various other big forces, even though these other forces hadn't participated in this competition. Chapter 463. They found it inconceivable to know that Yi Shiwen had condensed 1000 Tao principles. They believed that condensing 999 Tao principles was the limit. However, he had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Such strength could scare a person to death. This had already exceeded their expectations. A champion would emerge in every 100 years. However, it was quite difficult for those people to pose a threat to a person of the Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's rank. None of the previous champions had made him feel a sense of crisis. After all, talent was one thing. And, smoothly growing to such an altitude was another. However, his killing intention had risen very steeply after he had realized that Yi Xuan had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. In fact, the murderous intention was clearly visible in his eyes. He had a premonition in his mind that a person like Yi Xuan could pose enormous threat to the Xian Yuan Palace Hall in the future if they ignored him and allowed him to grow up. The Supreme Lord would have discovered his unconcealed, killing intention, on ordinary days. However, he was also in shock at this time. He obviously hadn't anticipated that Yi Xuan had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Only sage experts could accomplish this feat. In fact, 1,000 Tao principles was the beginning of the sage realm. Yi Xuan had 1,000 Tao principles, but his 1,000 Tao principles and a sage expert's 1,000 Tao principles were two entirely different things. A sage expert's 1,000 Tao principles would be scattered, but not disorganized. Moreover, the overall might of these principles would be endless. Therefore, the same 1,000 Tao principles would be far more tyrannical than those of Yi Xuan's. This was the precise reason that had made him realize that Yi Xuan hadn't made the breakthrough into the sage realm yet. However, this fact was even more stunning. It wouldn't have been strange for him if Yi Xuan had become a sage expert. Moreover, he was also very surprised by Yi Xuan's growth speed. These juniors of the younger generation had merely begun their cultivation journey as far as he was concerned. So, it didn't matter if they were a bit quick or a bit slower. One would be able to catch up with the others as long as they could come across some fortuitous adventures. However, Yi Xuan had accomplished this in the semi-sage realm itself. This showed that Yi Xuan might have astonishing potential, a potential which he wasn't aware of. His vision gradually turned resolute as he thought of this. Yi Xuan hadn't heard people's comments. However, he felt that many tyrannical gazes had been sweeping over his body since the moment he had released his 1,000 Tao principles. In fact, he felt as if these knife-like sharp gazes would cut open wounds in his body. In fact, he believed that these gazes would have been enough to kill him if he weren't inside the true martial university. However, he had already thought about this at the time when he had decided to reveal his 1,000 Tao principles. He knew what he wanted. He wanted to settle Emperor Chen's matter, once and for all. And, he didn't wish to delay any further. So, he must use his entire strength to kill Emperor Chen. A crazy idea had secretly popped up in his heart. He knew that many forces would wish to get rid of him soon after he would reveal his true strength. He didn't believe in the saying that a tall tree attracts the strong winds. However, that very same proverb also spoke that those very trees tend to grow even stronger and faster after they've survived through the rainstorm. And, they become far superior to the plants which have grown in the safety of a greenhouse. He wanted to take advantage of these external strong winds in order to temper himself and become even more tyrannical. Let the storm be even more violent. He felt that the world before his eyes had suddenly become much clearer after he had released his full strength. Many principles had remained hidden thus far, but they had unfolded themselves before his eyes at this time. Yi Xuan noticed that a golden ray of light was flickering in front of his eyes. It appeared like a golden strand of hair that was floating in the sky. It was even issuing slight fluctuations of spatial power. Could it be that the golden lion was setting the coordinates with the help of these golden hairs? Yi Xuan's eyes lit up. Suddenly, everything became clear in front of his eyes. He had been thinking that one must possess spatial coordinates in order to travel back and forth in the space since the chaos flowed in the subspace. One may take a small step into the subspace. However, they might arrive at an unknown place when they would reappear in the main space. It was also possible to get lost inside the flowing chaos as a result. A powerhouse wouldn't need this kind of a positioning system because they could see the main space from the subspace. However, it should have been impossible for this immature golden lion to achieve that in the restricted space of the metropolis Marshall Peak. Therefore, Yishuan had been wondering about what the golden lion had been using for fixing the coordinates. And, he realized what that thing was when he saw the golden hair. Whoosh! Emperor Chen suddenly reappeared. But, Yishuan was already prepared. In fact, he noticed that the hair of the golden lion issued a spatial array at the spot where Emperor Chen had appeared. I see. Yishuan shouted loudly. He brandished his sword. The sword energy soared into the sky like a rainbow, and instantly swept down like a giant golden dragon. Emperor Chen disappeared hastily as soon as he saw that Yishuan had discovered him. This battle is already decided. It will be very difficult for Emperor Chen to make a comeback even though he possesses the spatial ability. It's not that he's not enough strong. Rather, Yishuan is extremely powerful. 1000 Tao Principles in Semi-Sage Realm. I've never heard of this. Someone said regretfully. Everyone in the surroundings looked at him. He turned out to be a disciple of the Muddy Sky Island. He had lost his confidence on Emperor Chen. His expression had made it evident that he had been stunned by Yishuan. Yeah. Yishuan has constantly maintained himself at his peak condition. His secret healing technique is also exceptional. He doesn't even need to keep himself at his peak state for a long time. He only needs to do it for a bit longer than Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen can't go on like this for long. He'll get exhausted soon. So, he must attack with the entirety of his strength, and as early as possible. Otherwise, he may not need to attack Yishuan later since he'll die inside the space's chaos. Someone had clearly understood what this scene represented. Emperor Chen's strength is on the level of previous champions. He would have won if he hadn't encountered a freak like Yishuan. All I can say that he's very unlucky. Yishuan suddenly moved to the middle of the arena for some unknown reason. Then, he brandished his long sword, and unleashed the Buried Heaven Sword attack. A seemingly endless sword light burst out as a result. The attack spread in midair, and went straight towards an empty spot. The spectators were baffled by this. After all, Yishuan had acted like some crazy guy who had issued the sword attack towards an empty spot where no one was present. The space suddenly began to fluctuate violently after Yishuan launched the attack. Then, Emperor Chen's figure reappeared in front of the sword attack. Emperor Chen realized that a giant sword was already present in front of him as soon as he appeared. His complexion turned pale as a result. He didn't understand how his whereabouts had been ascertained. How was it possible? How had Yishuan discovered his whereabouts? Puchi. Emperor Chen didn't get enough time to think. Yishuan's long sword had already cut into his shoulder. Emperor Chen's body was extremely intrepid, and could be compared with metals and stones. However, it was like butter in front of this dreadful sword intention, and got cut as a result. Blood splashed out, and showered down to the ground. Each drop of blood opened a small pit in the ground. This scene was exceptionally terrifying. Emperor Chen's entire arm had been chopped off. It had seemed that his entire body would be cut into two halves by Yishuan's sword. However, he had snorted eerily and had maneuvered his body to shift sideways in order to avoid this fatal sword strike at that critical moment. However, his entire arm had still been cut off by Yishuan. His blood was gushing out like a fountain. Emperor Chen's complexion had turned pale. He promptly urged his golden lion, and disappeared into the space once again. This entire scene had taken place in a split second. No one had anticipated that they would see such a scene. An arm of the incomparably tyrannical Emperor Chen had been chopped off by Yishuan's sword. Moreover, this hadn't even been the most surprising spectacle for most people. They were mostly surprised by the fact that Yishuan had ascertained Emperor Chen's whereabouts in advance. One must know that Emperor Chen's spatial ability hadn't been able to take advantage of Yishuan so far because Yishuan's reaction speed was fast enough. In fact, Yishuan's attacks would always impact first even though he would attack second. However, it was different this time. Everyone had seen that Yishuan had attacked first. Yishuan had brandished his sword first. Then, Emperor Chen had appeared right at that spot. In fact, it had seemed as if both of them were coordinating with each other. It was as if Emperor Chen had presented himself before Yishuan's sword so that Yishuan could kill him. It seemed as if both of them had sparred together many a times. Yishuan had brandished his sword, and Emperor Chen had voluntarily appeared before it to get chopped off. Everyone obviously wouldn't think that they were coordinating with each other. So, there was only one possibility. And, that was that Yishuan had seen through Emperor Chen's whereabouts. In fact, he might have predicted it in advance. This was extremely dreadful. The spatial ability was the most dreadful ability because one could appear and disappear in an unpredictable fashion with the help of this ability. A person with spatial ability could easily hide inside the subspace, and could then look for the most appropriate opportunity to attack. However, Emperor Chen suddenly appeared defenseless in front of Yishuan since he had unexpectedly lost the advantage of this ability. There wasn't any suspense left in this battle. Yishuan suddenly found a tiny golden hair floating away at an astonishing speed at this time. So, he realized that Emperor Chen must be trying to escape. Emperor Chen had repeatedly faced defeats against Yishuan. However, he was still very strong. So, it would become very troublesome for Yishuan if he managed to escape. Yishuan decided against waiting any further. He shouted loudly. The heavenly source mirror within his body suddenly released an astonishing blood column. The scarlet energy began to boil, and flooded within Yishuan's body. Then, the heavenly source mirror integrated into his body. And, he felt that his entire body had started to brim with power. Hidden dragon rises from the abyss. Yishuan shouted loudly. A tinge of scarlet appeared on his golden hands. His hands suddenly transformed into a pair of dragon's claws. And, he ripped open a huge crack in the space with these claws. The one-armed Emperor Chen appeared in front of Yishuan as a result. He was about to escape when he discovered that Yishuan had suddenly appeared in front of him. Puchi. The sword energy condensed into a huge sword. It started from the top of Emperor Chen's head, and ran through his body as it pierced downward. Emperor Chen and his mount had been crucified in the chaos. Chapter 464. Everyone held their breaths. There was pin-drop silence. Only a light breeze was blowing, but it carried the smell of blood with it. Some people felt somewhat nauseated because of it. Emperor Chen is dead. How can he die in this way? He died, just like that, someone spoke up as he watched the scene in disbelief. After all, Emperor Chen was extremely powerful in their opinion. And yet, he had been impaled alive by Yishuan in front of their eyes. Everyone had mentally prepared themselves for this outcome. After all, Emperor Chen had been firmly suppressed by Yishuan from the get-go. However, watching Yishuan killing Emperor Chen for real was a bit difficult for them to gulp. They had long thought that Emperor Chen would win this competition. Yishuan had merely been one of the 8 powerful Heaven's Pride experts in their eyes. And, Yishuan's status as one of the 8 powerful Heaven's Pride expert didn't bother them at all. However, it was impossible for them to think that he would win the championship. However, Yishuan had swept away his opponents, and had reached the top like a dark horse. Even the most tyrannical opponent wasn't able to withstand even one blow from him. And, Emperor Chen was no exception to this. He had been thoroughly suppressed by Yishuan in large parts of the fight. Even his spatial ability couldn't make any difference. He had radically seemed to be worthless in front of Yishuan. The slim figure of Yishuan was standing in the arena. His facial expression looked as fresh as the clouds and as reckless as the wind. It seemed as if he had killed an insignificant man. Some people were terrified to see Yishuan's might. Perhaps he was nothing at present. However, he might become an extremely dreadful person in the future after a few centuries once he would grow up. He had condensed 1,000 Tao principles in the semi-sage realm. In fact, nobody could tell what his accomplishments in the future would be once they'd take his talent was taken into consideration. A person like Yi Xuan wasn't terrifying at the present. However, his tyranny would be most dreadful in the future. Countless gazes swept over Yi Xuan's body. And, there was no lack of genuine murderous auras amongst those gazes. It could be said that most people of forces other than true martial universities wanted to get rid of him. Yi Xuan softly let out a sigh of relief. He felt very relaxed at this time. It seemed as if his inner realm had suddenly broken free of all the shackles. His cultivation level hadn't advanced, but his strength had already reached the pinnacle of the semi-sage realm. His strength should be able to make a breakthrough to the initial stage of the sage realm, as long as he would go through closed-door training one more time. His strength would then become comparable to the strength of the sage experts. Yi Xuan would then be worthy of his current status of a core disciple. The core disciples were generally sage experts, unless in special circumstances. Yi Xuan had defeated Emperor Chen. And, the situation made it seem as if he had completely suppressed Emperor Chen before he had defeated the man in a thorough manner. However, only he knew how much preparation he had to do in order to defeat Emperor Chen. He had only considered Emperor Chen to be his most dreadful opponent since the beginning. He had also considered various battle scenarios. However, Emperor Chen had never cared enough about him to bother with such things. Therefore, one could say that Emperor Chen's defeat at Yi Xuan's hand was to be expected from this angle. And, it wasn't an exaggeration as guessed by the other people. Yi Xuan was still quite afraid of Emperor Chen, even though he had already killed him. Emperor Chen wasn't strong. He was insanely strong. This championship would have fallen into his hands if I weren't here. He would have still been at the invincible position even if he had bumped into some other expert who had condensed 1,000 Tao principles, especially if one takes his spatial ability into consideration. In fact, he might even have defeated that opponent. Moreover, he would have become more dreadful once this spatial ability had matured further. He would have become extremely ferocious in the future. Even his golden lion would have matured in a similar fashion. He might even have condensed 1,000 Tao principles later on. Anyway, Yi Xuan had killed Emperor Chen. Therefore, he had removed the worry from his heart. And, he could relax for the time being. He had also obtained enormous benefits after going through the tough battle. Now, he must look for an opportunity to undergo closed-door training in order to make a breakthrough. More so because he would have to face a myriad of schemes and plots in the future. He would certainly have the power to defend himself once his fighting strength would make a breakthrough to the sage realm. So, this was very important for him. The atmosphere had suddenly turned lively after a moment of strange silence. Everyone was discussing the sensational matter of Emperor Chen's death at Yi Xuan's hands. Even the people who had confidence in Yi Xuan before the contest had started hadn't thought that he could reach the top and become the champion. Most people would have considered him outstanding if he had managed to withdraw from the battle with his body intact. They placed themselves in the shoes of Yi Xuan, and thought that they would have thanked their ancestors if they had managed to get out with their body intact. However, the eyes of the Lord of Muddy Sky Island had turned ice-cold atop the tall platform. His complexion had turned ashen since he was watching Yi Xuan stand in the square. However, he couldn't say anything. He had been very calm and collected earlier. He hadn't been worried because he had too much confidence in Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen was invincible among the contestants of the four forces in his opinion. Yi Xuan was nothing. He hadn't even heard of Yi Xuan before. He had thought that Yi Xuan could only cause a bit of trouble for Emperor Chen even if he were to be extremely good. However, Yi Xuan had given a tight slap on his face through his powerful performance. Yi Xuan had made him realize that the Emperor Chen he had placed high hopes in wasn't as powerful as he had taken him to be. Therefore, he had been forced to accept that Emperor Chen's miserable end after he had watched Yi Xuan's peak strength. Most importantly, he couldn't say anything about this fight. He couldn't find a reason to intervene. After all, Emperor Chen had gone out to look for trouble on his own accord. he himself had been in the wrong. It was already enough that the Supreme Lord hadn't caused trouble for Emperor Chen when he had broken the rule. Moreover, Yishuan had defeated him by relying entirely on his own strength. He was burning with rage because of this feeling. However, he couldn't find any reason to vent his anger. He could only hold back forcibly. He had firmly grabbed the armrest of the throne with his both hands. The armrest was made up of jade. However, it crumbled like rotten dregs in his grip. Meanwhile, the complexion of the lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had also turned ugly. He had spoken many sarcastic words before the beginning of this contest. In fact, he had openly mocked Yishuan. The Supreme Lord hadn't mentioned a word of it at this time. However, he could still imagine what must be going on in the Supreme Lord's mind regarding his contemptuous and taunting comments. It seemed as if he had voluntarily flung several tight slaps on his face by opposing the true martial university. In fact, he was so depressed that he wanted to die. Therefore, the killing intention had become stronger in his eyes as he looked at Yishuan. A mysterious light was flashing in the eyes of the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave. Nobody could tell what he was thinking. He would always look like an illiterate. However, nobody dared to regard him as one. And, those who'd regarded him as one would only end up vomiting blood when they'd find out that he was only pretending to be illiterate. Yishuan is the winner of the finals, and the champion, the refereeing elder declared the result. Everyone came to their senses, and realized that this competition had finally ended. This term's competition had been brutal. It had left everyone in shock. Only 3 out of the 8 Big Heavens Pride experts had survived it. One was Hang Bing Wang apart from Yishuan, but he was still recuperating from his wounds. The other was Jin Wushang, but he had admitted defeat without a fight. However, the casualty rate had been more than 50% even then. It could be said that this competition had been nothing less than tragic, but not the most tragic one. However, it had undoubtedly been the most splendid one. Particularly, Yishuan had managed to defeat Emperor Qin even though the latter had revealed the spatial ability. Countless people had regretted the fact that any of these two individuals were capable enough to win the championship if they had appeared in the former competition. However, they had appeared in this competition, so one of them had to die. It was like the saying, a mountain can't accommodate 2 tigers. Therefore, a showdown was necessary to decide the victor. Everyone was still immersed in that battle even though the referee had declared Yishuan as the winner. They hadn't come out of it yet. This term was coming to an end. The space suddenly fluctuated in a violent manner, right when the atmosphere was about to turn lively. It seemed as if a picture scroll had been torn as a huge black crack was torn open in the sky in the fortified space of the metropolis Marshall Peak. Then, 2 women rapidly flew out of it. The one in the front looked like a young woman. She seemed approximately 25 or 26 years old. She looked stunning. She looked quick-witted, and had nice facial features. She looked very elegant. She was clad in a fire-colored long dress. It undoubtedly outlined her splendid figure. Her long hair was gently tied at the back of her body. Her thin lips looked smooth. She had a majestic presence. She was followed by a young girl. This young girl looked approximately 17 or 18 years old. Her big dark eyes glittered. She had thin lips, and her skin was fairer than snow. She looked beautiful. She was clad in a green and long robe, and seemed elegant and refined. However, there was a look of anxiety and disbelief on her face. Who are you people? How dare you trespass into the true martial university? The Supreme Lord's dignified voice thundered ferociously. Who are these people? They have actually dared to intrude into the true martial university. They are so bold. You don't know. They aren't the people of your true martial university. No, I've never seen them. And, didn't you hear what the Supreme Lord spoke just now? They obviously don't belong to our true martial university. So beautiful. I would even be willing to die if I can get close to them in this lifetime. The sudden arrival of these two women had shifted the attentions of everyone from Emperor Chen's death. However, they had also made the Supreme Lord extremely furious. This was the true martial university, not some ordinary region. Moreover, it was the Metropolis Martial Peak, a very important place in the true martial university. It was a place of pilgrimage, not only for the people of true martial university, but also for the people of the entire southern region. In fact, many Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm experts were personally keeping watch over this area because of this competition. The saying, experts such as clouds, wasn't enough to describe the number of experts who had been stationed on the Metropolis Martial Peak at present. However, these two women had barged in a very casual manner. These two women had either had their heads kicked by a donkey, and had probably turned into idiots because of that, or they were truly skillful and bold people. And, everyone had to bet on the second possibility after they saw the calm and collected appearance of that woman in red. She seemed like a skilled powerhouse, someone who was daring enough to regard the true martial university as nothing. Brother Taihe. That young girl in green ignored those countless gazes, and went flying towards Yi Shiwen. While everyone was still trying to guess what she was up to. So, they were very surprised to see that she had thrown herself upon the golden lion's body. Then, she began to cry. She looked extremely sad. Her beautiful face had gotten stained with tears. Excuse us. We don't wish to oppose the true martial university. We only wish to take our deceased back, the woman in red solemnly explained. It's you. You killed Brother Taihe. I must kill you and take revenge for him. That young girl in green clothes suddenly raised her head, and spoke out in anger. The murderous intent flashed across her face as she looked at Yi Shiwen. Chapter 465. Published at 28th of November 2017, 8:25 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 465. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The murderous intent had flooded the eyes of that young girl. Suddenly, a terrifying aura also erupted from her body. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it swept down towards Yi Shiwen to crush him like a mighty wave. A startled look flashed in Yi Shiwen's eyes. The golden divinities immediately crawled over his body. He appeared like a god clad in golden clothes. This was his Bodhi's instinctive response. He hadn't activated his gilded tyrant form. This girl had forced Yi Shiwen's body to activate the gilded tyrant form by using her imposing aura. Her strength was also a bit more tyrannical than that of Emperor Chen in Yi Shiwen's opinion. Yi Shiwen had become even more wary after he had heard the girl address that golden lion as brother, because he knew that the golden lion belonged to the demon island. And, the girl and the golden lion clearly knew each other. Therefore, even she might belong to the demon island. He was mostly afraid because of this reason. One must know that the demon island was a very mysterious place. Yi Shiwen was still very terrified of the demon island. He wasn't even a truth expert at that time. He had visited that island for the first time. He didn't know anything about this place at that time. He had merely touched the tip of the iceberg. There were many things that he was unaware of. There were many weird places which could leave a person baffled. He had asked the wolf cub at that time. However, the wolf cub hadn't said anything. This had made the demon island even more secretive a place in his eyes. And, this girl's strength had amazed him even more. She was already at the peak of the semi-sage realm. Her imposing aura was no less than his. And, he had become even more vigilant because of this. So, he was cautious to protect himself from this girl's sudden attack. Bai Lian, stop. The murderous intent was flashing across that girl's face. It seemed as if she was about to attack. However, she was stopped by the woman in red. Have you forgotten how I had repeatedly warned you before we came here? But, this bastard killed Brother Taihe. That girl in green was emotional at the moment. Her face appeared a bit grim because of the distorted expression on it. Huang Taihe had chosen this path. This is his destiny, the woman insipidly said. He had chosen to temper himself under the shadow of a human. He must have been prepared for this day as well. You're not a kid. You should understand that every person is responsible for their own decisions. I don't care. He has killed Brother Taiha. So, he must die as well, the girl in green shouted loudly. Shut up. Or, I will personally take you back, the woman coldly shouted back at the girl. The green-clothed girl had no choice but to shut up resentfully when she saw that the woman in red had gotten angry. However, she was still glaring at Yi Shiwen, and her eyes were brimming with hatred. Yi Shiwen could feel that these two women weren't humans. They had concealed their identities very well, but he was exceptionally sensitive to any unusual aura because he had perfected the restraining breath technique. Moreover, it was evident that this green-clothed girl and the golden lion must be closely related to each other. And, Yi Shiwen had understood this after he had seen her must-kill-him appearance. Even the wolf cub might belong to the same place, and probably had the same origin. Yi Shiwen had seen all kinds of mysterious aspects of the wolf cub. Therefore, he didn't dare to look down on these women. Everyone was stupefied as they heard the dialogues of these two women. One of them wanted to kill Yi Shiwen. But, the other one didn't. What was going on here? Why hadn't they reached an agreement before they had come here? Young lady, I am not aware why you've come here, the Supreme Lord broke the silence and spoke. His voice penetrated the clouds and mists above the tall platform, and reached everyone's ears. People obviously weren't expecting the intruders to be attacked in a direct manner. They were expecting that the intruders would be captured, and interrogated after that. Even the Supreme Lord felt that the aura of the woman in red was very terrifying. However, he couldn't feel any hostility from her. So, there was no need to fight with them to the death. She possibly had the support of some big force. And, he also felt that the Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the other lords were taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. They were hoping for him to die in a battle with this woman since they would obtain great benefits for being the third party in this dispute. However, the Supreme Lord wouldn't let them obtain any benefits whatsoever. Please, don't take us in a wrong way. We don't have any grudges against your university. We also don't have any evil intentions. We only wish to take away our clan's member, the woman in red explained to clarify the doubts. She possessed tyrannical strength, but it would be akin to courting death if she would try to cause trouble for the true martial university. Especially on the metropolis martial peak, where there were as many experts as clouds. Many great sage experts were keeping watch on this place. Who would dare to be presumptuous here? The woman in red had pointed towards the golden lion's corpse, a corpse that had already turned cold. You're not from the human race, the Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall opened his mouth and asked. The entire place immediately turned silent. This world was very big. The human race wasn't all that existed in this world. However, the world was big if one would call it big, and it was also small if one would call it so. The natural resources were limited. So, a race must fight with other races if they wanted to grow. For example, the devil race had invaded the true martial world several times. It could be said that they had barged inside in order to fight for the resources. Two different races very rarely had good relations. In fact, many races were mortal enemies. Therefore, this remark of the Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had turned the entire place silence. In fact, there was a pin-drop silence on the peak. Everyone had held their breath. Everyone looked towards the Supreme Lord. They all wanted to hear what he had to say. He shot a glance at the Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. Wouldn't he have understood why the other person had spoken such words? He obviously wanted to arouse a conflict between this woman and the true martial university. In fact, it would be best if he could extend full support to this woman against the true martial university. In that case, the other forces would be able to obtain great benefits since they'd be the third party in this dispute. The Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall was a very conniving person. We won't stop you since you wish to take away your clan's member, the Supreme Lord replied indifferently. He had nothing to do with the relation between the Golden Lion and the Muddy Sky Island. So, he was merely doing her a favor at little to no cost. In fact, it would be good for the true Martial University if a conflict were to break out between the Muddy Sky Island and the big force that supported this woman. The face of the Lord of Muddy Sky Island had turned a bit ugly. He wanted to take the corpse of the Golden Lion away. After all, it was a strange beast which possessed spatial ability. It was rare. So, he could have obtained an enormous benefit if he could research its spatial ability. However, he had no choice but to nod in a bitter manner. This was the true Martial University's region. So, he wouldn't be able to keep the corpse of the Golden Lion if he didn't get the true Martial University's support. Thanks a lot, the woman cupped her hands in obeisance and replied. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island got depressed. In fact, he felt like vomiting blood. You are making a big mistake. You should be thanking me for giving up the lion's corpse. This Supreme Lord of the true Martial University has seized my opportunity of doing a favor. However, could he say this? Obviously not. It wasn't good to offend a stranger to obtain the corpse of the Golden Lion. There might be a very tyrannical force behind her. So, he might have to suffer a great loss for being greedy over a small profit. The green-clothed girl turned around as she held the corpse of the Golden Lion in her hands. And, she looked at Yi Shiwen in a very fierce manner. Her expression had turned very sinister. The woman in red trod in the void, and came down from midair. She arrived in front of Yi Shiwen and said, "You're quite good." Yi Shiwen became a bit confused when he heard this. He knew that he had provoked that young girl in green. In fact, he would do the same again if given a chance. After all, he would have died if he hadn't killed them instead. So, there was no chance of holding back in that situation. The woman revealed a smile when she saw him looking confused. She spoke, "Someone has asked me to tell you that he would come looking for you after would come out of the closed-door training. And, he will teach you a good lesson." How could Yi Shiwen not have understood this? It had to be the wolf cub. So, this woman must also be from the Demon Island. No wonder she possessed such incredible strength. Even a person like the Supreme Lord hadn't dared to act blindly when it had come to dealing with her. The wolf cub had been tidied up terribly by Yi Shiwen when they had met for the first time. And, he had been clamoring that he would take revenge ever since. He would also tidy up Yi Shiwen very miserably sooner or later. In fact, he had often looked for an opportunity to fight with Yi Shiwen every time after he had made a breakthrough. However, unfortunately it was always Yi Shiwen who'd teach him a lesson every time. "Is he doing fine?" Yi Shiwen asked. "He's undergoing a closed-door training," the woman in red replied. Yi Shiwen felt relieved after he came to know that the wolf cub was doing fine. The woman disappeared into the void after she was done speaking. That girl in green shot a hateful glance at Yi Shiwen, and disappeared into the void. Everyone suddenly came back to their senses as soon as those two women departed. These two women were extremely audacious. Does your true Martial University have a paper barrier that allows anyone to come in and go out as they wish? A disciple of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall spoke with a schadenfreude expression. This matter had obviously struck the true Martial University's prestige a bit. The opposite party obviously hadn't harbored evil intentions. However, this incident had still given a blow to the true Martial University's prestige. Humph. They weren't humans. They must be from the demon race or some other alien race. I think demon race. Didn't you hear what she said? She had arrived to take away her clan's member. That golden lion belongs to the demon race of the Demon Island. Therefore, these two women clearly belong to the demon race as well. This martial arts competition between the four forces had finally come to an end. And, it had ended perfectly. This martial arts competition had revealed one climax after another. The Xian Yuan twin stars brothers had been everyone's favorites to win this competition because of their outstanding reputation at the start. Then, Emperor Qin had revealed his spatial ability, and had replaced them as the favorites. However, Yi Shiwen turned out to be the finest dark horse. Another disciple of the true martial university had also entered the semifinals. However, everyone felt that he was merely lucky. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to enter the semifinals since his strength was equal to that of a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert. Luck was also a part of strength. However, he still couldn't obtain everyone's acknowledgement. Only Yi Shiwen could be considered as the perfect dark horse. Initially, he was merely ranked among the 8 big Heaven's Pride experts. And nobody had been optimistic about him. However, he had revealed astonishing strength once the competition had begun. People had been very optimistic about characters like Qi Tian, Twin Stars brothers, and Emperor Chen. However, all of them had been killed by Yi Shiwen. He had turned out to be the ultimate winner. Chapter 466. The martial arts competition between the 4 forces had come to an end. Yi Shiwen had won this term's championship amidst the cheers of everyone. The outcome of almost all the previous competitions had been controversial. However, one could hardly raise any question on the outcome of this term's competition. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the other forces were certainly depressed. However, they didn't show any objection on the outcome. They had seen the entire competition with their own eyes. They had seen that Yi Shiwen had effortlessly defeated his enemies by relying on his tyrannical strength. Moreover, they had witnessed his transformed appearance in his final battle with Emperor Chen. It's not that the other people were too weak. Rather, Yi Shiwen was far too strong. Wouldn't those who had lost at Yi Shiwen's hands have lost their faces even further if they had raised questions on him? Therefore, hardly anyone raised any question once the martial arts competition came to an end. Several people gasped in surprise though. However, the competition had ended anyway. They could no longer change the result. In fact, the people of the major forces had already started to pack their bags in order to return to their respective homes. 3 major forces had suffered disastrous losses in this time's competition. The Fire Cloud Cave's only Heaven's Pride expert, Qi Tian, had been killed by Yi Shiwen. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall had high hopes for Twin Stars' brother. However, they couldn't even display their true strength in the fight, and had ultimately been defeated by Yi Shiwen. They weren't able to collaborate and attack together. Many people had found that to be a very pitiful fact. The Muddy Sky Island's condition was better among those 3 forces. After all, Sea Demon Jin Wushan was still alive. He had surrendered in front of Emperor Chen since they were acquaintances. Therefore, he hadn't died. The true martial university was this time's victor. But, even their condition wasn't good. They had lost Qin Wang. And, Han Bing Wang had been injured seriously, and hadn't been able to recover as yet. Yi Shiwen had won the championship. But, that was only a modest compensation at most. This had been a brutal competition. All the participants were outstanding experts. In fact, many people went as far as to say that no matter how powerful these Heaven's Pride experts were, they all were merely meant to pave the way for the champion in the end. The road to invincibility is paved with endless skeletons. And, these people might also end up becoming the bones to pave others' road to invincibility. Everyone trembled in fear as they thought of this possibility. Therefore, the number of participants wasn't too big in comparison to the enormous population of disciple community. Even the lucrative rewards hadn't helped this fact. However, this competition had already ended. And, it had left behind countless memories. In fact, it had also left behind an invincible legend. Yi Shiwen's tyrannical figure had entered into their eyes for the first time. But, it had engraved itself into their souls. They might never forget that a man named Yi Shiwen had suppressed many outstanding experts fair and square to win the championship. Yi Shiwen's name had spread throughout the world after this competition. In fact, he had also become famous in the distant central region through the word of mouth. People had started to praise Yi Shiwen as an outstanding young expert from the southern region. He was undoubtedly on the verge of giving shock to countless young experts. And, there were many who now considered him an eyesore. And, such people desperately wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible. However, becoming invincible in the future wasn't Yi Shiwen's goal. He had wanted to temper himself through this competition. This was the reason for which he had returned to participate in this martial arts competition, and this had been his greatest harvest as well. There were other rewards as well. And, his wealth had increased considerably after this competition. His stock of primary spirit dawn had surpassed 20 million. Apart from the champion's reward he got by winning the competition, he also won 3 million primary spirit dawn for betting on his own victory. However, the biggest reward had come from the Jade Yang Peak, an amount of 10 million primary spirit dawn. He still remembered the astonished look in the eyes of the expert of the Jade Yang Peak who had arrived to give him the primary spirit dawn. They perhaps hadn't thought of a possibility wherein he'd become the champion in the end. The Jade Yang Peak had offered a reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn in a rage because Emperor Chen had killed Qin Wang. However, they hadn't believed that Yi Shiwen could kill Emperor Chen. Yi Shiwen had been famous from the start. He was considered very tyrannical in the younger generation. However, Emperor Chen was extremely powerful. After all, even Qin Wang hadn't lasted long in front of him, and had been killed rather easily by Emperor Chen. So, how could Yi Shiwen possibly kill Emperor Chen? It could be said that they were overestimating Emperor Chen. It would be better to say that they hadn't expected that there could be such a big disparity between Yi Shiwen and Qin Wang. Qin Wang had lost in front of Emperor Chen very easily. But, the latter didn't stand a chance against Yi Shiwen. This was like a mockery on Qin Wang's memory. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care about how astonished that expert of the Jade Yang Peak was. Obtaining this reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn was the most important thing for him. He wasn't even worried that the said person would refuse to give him the reward. After all, 10 million primary spirit dawn was an astronomical wealth for a semi-sage experts. In fact, it wasn't a small amount for the sage realm experts either. However, this amount wasn't enough to make such a countless years old inheritance like Jade Yang Peak to break their promise to reward Yi Shiwen. After all, it was one among the top 10 inheritances. Now, Yi Shiwen didn't need to worry about the shortage of primary spirit dawn before he had made a breakthrough into the sage realm, since he possessed more than 20 million in his stock. The consumption rate of primary spirit dawn for his cultivation was much higher than that for an ordinary person. However, 20 million primary spirit dawn were still enough. Yi Shiwen was about to leave for the Hidden Star Peak from the Metropolis Martial Peak when he saw a young man rushing over from some distance. This man had a very fair skin tone. "Brother Yi, please wait," that young man saw Yi Shiwen, and immediately asked him to stop. Yi Shiwen saw his clothes. He seemed like a disciple of the Metropolis Martial Peak. But, he had restrained his aura. Moreover, the principles in his body were condensed together, not scattered. This meant that this man was a sage expert. "May I know the senior brother's name?" Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in obeisance and asked. "My name is Zheng Heshu," the young man smiled and replied. A smile as bright as the sun appeared on his face. However, it wasn't as dazzling as Qi Fifen's smile. His smile looked a bit milder to that of Qi Fifen. "Nice to meet you, senior brother Zheng. What's the reason behind your visit?" Yi Shiwen asked doubtfully. He had already received the champion's reward. So, what else it could be? "Actually, the Supreme Lord has sent me to inform junior brother Yi that the Water Moon Cave will be open for you tomorrow. It is located inside the true martial secret territory. I hope that young brother Yi makes preparations since the allotted time is 3 years. Zheng Heshu replied as he looked at Yi Shiwen. An inexplicable look of envy could be seen flashing in his eyes. True martial secret territory? Yi Shiwen trembled as soon as he heard these 4 words. So it's the true martial secret territory. True martial secret territory was extremely famous in the True Martial University. However, not everyone knew where it was located. On the contrary, only a very few people knew about what was inside the True Martial secret territory, even though it was extremely famous. And that's because the true Marshal's secret territory wasn't open to ordinary people. It was accessible only to a few core disciples, and that too only to a very few outstanding core disciples. Only the seed disciples that were at the peak of the sage realm got the opportunity to enter true Marshal's secret territory. A place like the true Marshal's secret territory had left behind endless legends for the experts below the rank of core disciples. And this was the true Marshall University's core place as per the legends. There were obviously many rumors floating around in the true Marshall University. One such rumor said that several old and monstrous experts had died in a seated posture, or had vanished within true Marshall's secret territory. And they had become living fossils now. But these very people had once practiced with full devotion within the true Marshall's secret territory in the hope to make a breakthrough to the next realm. However, it was still a sacred place for many disciples of the true Marshall University. It was said that the founder had once established the true Marshall University's orthodox teaching in the true Marshall's secret territory. Only a handful of elite true disciples were allowed to enter the true Marshall's secret territory apart from those highest-level elders. Nobody had ever heard that any disciple below the rank of core disciples had gotten the opportunity to enter this place. Yi Shiwen was barely hanging to the rank of core disciple since he was still at the semi-sage realm. So, he wasn't a full-fledged core disciple yet. Everyone who had gone there had advanced by leaps and bounds in the ensuing years, and had become the true Marshall University's pillars and elites soon after they had come out of that place. And that was because only the outstanding core disciples who were at the Sage Great Complete Realm would get to go there on normal occasions. So, they would come out as great sage exerts. Therefore, it could be said that this was also a shortcut that led to the Great Sage Realm. Yi Shiwen had obviously yearned for the true Marshall's secret territory as well. However, he hadn't really thought about it before when it came to it. That's because his strength wasn't enough for it. The rank of a core disciple was certainly attached to his name. However, he was far from the standards of a core disciple. The Sage Realm was still far away. Let alone the Sage Great Complete Realm. The gap between that and his current level was the same as the difference between cloud and mud, or the heaven and earth. In fact, he might not be allowed to enter the true Marshall's secret territory even if he were to reach the Sage Great Complete Realm. Only those who had performed a great service to the true Marshall University possessed enough accumulated points to enter this place. One would gain points every time one would complete a mission for the true Marshall University. And only those who had enough points could enter this place. However, all those points would be exchanged for days they'd get to spend inside the place at the time of their entry. In fact, a year's time could make a sage expert go bankrupt. Let alone 3 years. 3 years' time was quite short for an expert. More so because of the closed-door training sessions, and so on. In fact, it would pass in a split second. However, it mattered a lot when it came to aspect of the location that one was undergoing closed-door training at. And one could obtain unimaginable benefits in 3 years of closed-door training inside the true Marshall secret territory. Yes, young brother Yi. Your performance was outstanding this time. It has greatly boosted the prestige of our true Marshall University. Your outstanding performance has been taken into account, and you will gain access to the Water Moon Cave inside the true Marshall secret territory for 3 years as your reward. Zheng Heshu looked at Yi Shiwen and replied. An exceptionally envious look flashed in his eyes as he said this. Even he could only dream about a place like the true Marshall secret territory since he didn't have enough points to enter it. It wasn't that he didn't have enough points to enter it for even 1 day. However, spending 1 or 2 days in that place was insignificant. One must at least have enough points for more than 1 month's stay to see any significant results. Chapter 467, Northern Dipper Organization. Zheng Heshu realized that Yi Shiwen had no knowledge on the subject as soon as he saw him. So, he explained to Yi Shiwen. The true Marshall secret territory was very huge. And it was divided into different regions. Each of these regions had different functions. The Water Moon Cave A Water Moon Fairyland wasn't a cave in reality. Rather, it was an entire region. The founder of the true martial university had gained enlightenment inside the Water Moon Cave, and that cave was located in the Water Moon Fairyland. Consequently, he had laid the foundation of the true martial university. There were many leftover martial art heritages in this Water Moon Fairyland. Some people said that the ancestors of the true martial university had created these heritages, and had then left them behind for the later generations. However, some people also said that these startling heritages had pre-existed the era of the ancestors. And, the ancestors of the true martial university had merely obtained them. Every influential person in the university knew this fact, that the human race of the true marital world had migrated from other regions. Therefore, this explanation was also quite popular. In other words, the Supreme Lord had allowed Yi Shiwen to choose one of the heritages for his cultivation. In fact, there were 49 types of heritages in the Water Moon Fairyland. However, one could advance by leaps and bounds to become an extremely ferocious great sage expert as long as one could master any one of these heritages. Nobody had studied in the entirety of these 49 heritages on a trot so far. Rumors say that nobody had achieved that feat, apart from the founder of the true martial university. Each of these 49 stunning heritages possessed great might, and was worth studying diligently for a lifetime. However, one wouldn't even be able to perfect a single technique if they tried to forcefully study all of these heritages at once. And, their hard work would go in vain as a result. This was definitely a generous reward for Yi Shiwen regardless of which angle one would consider this from. Therefore, it could be assumed that the upper echelon must have been very pleased with him this time. Yi Shiwen finally felt that the upper echelon was attaching great importance to him now. His level promotion had always fallen behind in comparison to the others. So, the top authorities had always been doubtful whether they should focus on nurturing him or not. Moreover, the people of the law enforcement hall had always been hostile towards Yi Shiwen, and didn't want him to gain the attention of the top authorities. However, it didn't matter anymore. Nobody could neglect him anymore. After all, he had won the championship. This had made him excited. Hadn't he wished for this exact thing to happen? Yi Shiwen had suddenly become widely famous after he won the championship. Everyone in the younger generation had started to consider him as the strongest person. Some people hadn't been convinced of this earlier. However, everyone had started to accept the fact that he possessed tyrannical strength after this competition came to an end. Yi Shiwen returned to the Hidden Star Peak after he bid his farewell to Zheng Heshu. He didn't wish to become the center of attraction. He would have to wait for a while for everything to turn normal. But, that wouldn't happen until everyone's attention had been diverted from the memory of this competition. Yi Shiwen returned to the Hidden Star Peak. However, he was surprised to see a young Taoist priest on the peak. And, this priest was looking at Yi Shiwen with a smiling expression of his face. He was clad in a moon-white robe, and his robe was faintly glowing under the moonlight. He was floating in the air like an immortal. His silhouette looked pure and spotless. He looked like an ordinary person, and seemed approximately 25 or 26 years old. However, he possessed a strangely clean and fresh aura which would make people curious. Qing Su. Yi Shiwen immediately recognized him, and called out his name. He was very surprised to see this person. He had never thought that he would see Qing Su here. They hadn't seen each other since a decade. They had met last when they had left the Demon Island. Yi Shiwen had a profound impression of this Taoist priest. In fact, it was very similar to the one he had about Emperor Chen. Qing Su was the only real monk he had seen in both his lives. He hadn't seen any Taoist priest in the true martial world apart from him. And, he had only seen the superficial ones in his previous life since most of them had been depraved over time. Therefore, he had always felt that the Taoist priests were rather poor before he had met Qing Su. However, there had been an enormous change in his point of view ever since he had met Qing Su. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't received any news of Emperor Chen and Qing Su after he had left the Demon Island. They had neither embarked on the ancient road, nor had they joined the true martial university. Therefore, he was quite surprised to see Qing Su in the true martial university. Yi Shiwen, congratulations for winning the championship. A gentle smile appeared on Qing Su's face, same as before. In fact, there wasn't any fake politeness in his demeanor, unlike the other monks. Yi Shiwen replied as he looked at him, "We haven't met in a decade. And, I'm not willing to believe that you've come here merely to congratulate me." He had spoken in a very blunt manner. However, he had good relations with Qing Su. The so-called friendship between gentlemen should be as insipid as water. That was probably the case here. "Let me explain this, Moon dear. I will come straight to the point, and without trying to cover things up like a woman," a hoarse voice suddenly sounded out of nowhere. Then, a tall figure came out from the void. Yi Shiwen saw this figure with the help of the moonlight's illumination. And, he saw a young man who was approximately 20 years old. He was almost 2 meters tall, and was clad in a white robe which had blended into the dim moonlight. Therefore, it was quite difficult for a person to spot him. Yi Shiwen frowned. He suddenly became vigilant in his heart. He hadn't discovered that someone was hidden in the void. It had happened because he had never been too vigilant on the hidden star peak. Moreover, this person's strength was very high. "What's this about?" Yi Shiwen asked. "I'll tell you." That tall man looked at Yi Shiwen and replied, "We wish to invite you to join our organization, the Northern Dipper." "The Northern Dipper?" Yi Shiwen asked. He secretly became alert. What type of an organization was this? How come he had never heard about this organization? "Our organization specializes in recruiting young elites. And, we only recruit the most outstanding young elites," that tall man answered. Yi Shiwen had heard of many such organizations. In fact, the Army of God had been one such organization. Wasn't this the characteristic of most organizations? There were many organizations like this. Only, their strengths varied. Some targeted the elites of an entire region. Some targeted only a country, while some only a city. "Are you also a member of this organization?" Yi Shiwen looked at Qing Su and asked. He wouldn't have paid attention to it if this were to be an ordinary organization. He himself could have established one such organization anytime and anywhere. However, he didn't have any interest in that. Even the formation of the Qianyu faction hadn't been his planning. He only believed in cultivating unfettered. However, it would be a different matter if Qing Su was also a member of this organization. Qing Su's strength had always been unfathomable. Yi Shiwen couldn't see through his cultivation. And, the tall man also possessed the same kind of unfathomable strength. This obviously indicated that the strength of this organization must be very impressive. Yes. Qing Su nodded. He didn't deny. Yi Shiwen also noticed that his white robe looked exactly the same as that of the other man's. "We had arrived to observe Emperor Chen. However, we found you more appropriate. So, we've come to invite you," the man insipidly said. Yi Shiwen immediately understood the matter. So, this was the reason. They must have seen today's fight between him and Emperor Chen. They had wanted to invite Emperor Chen. But, he died. So, they came to invite him instead. The fact was that no one wants to favor the dead. The fame and glory that Emperor Chen had gathered throughout his life had disappeared along with his defeat in the last fight. This was blatant truth. In other words, who would have remembered Yi Shiwen if he had been defeated in the last fight? "Sorry, but I have no interest in joining any organization since I don't like other people to have control over me." Yi Shiwen shook his head and replied. This organization's influence wasn't meager. Each of its members possessed great abilities. However, he was very afraid of joining one such organization. And, he particularly didn't have any interest in being controlled by other people. "You don't have to decide in a hurry." Qing Su opened his mouth and spoke up at this time, "Our organization isn't strict. So, it won't limit your freedom. They will at most inform you during the time of an assignment. However, they won't force you to complete the task. You will be free to choose whether you wish to complete a task or not. You can't imagine our organization's information network and the amount of resources we possess. Ching Su continued, you won't regret if you join our organization. Moreover, there are no mandatory requirements. Such benefits? Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes. He wasn't convinced. How could an organization give such nice treatment to its members? However, he didn't suspect that Ching Su was fooling him. He knew that this priest wouldn't deceive him because there was no need for that. Yi Shiwen would quickly find out the truth once he had joined this organization. Anyway, he genuinely trusted Ching Su. Has incredible resources and information network. However, it isn't compulsory to complete a task. How has such an organization not gone out of business yet? Of course, not everyone can enjoy such treatment. The tall man explained, only the official members of our organization get such treatment. People at the lower ranks need to complete corresponding tasks every month. Of course, you will also have to contribute corresponding points if you'd like to get additional resources apart from the basic ones. And, you'd only get those points from missions. Yi Shiwen understood the matters as he heard this man's explanation. This organization wouldn't be far from collapsing if everyone enjoyed such treatment. Most importantly, it wasn't compulsory to complete a task. However, one must complete the tasks if they wanted additional benefits. They wouldn't get extra resources if they didn't contribute points. It obviously wouldn't have been a good deal if he were to join as low-level member. However, he would be at much ease if were to become an official member of this organization from the start itself. He would then be free to choose whether he wanted to undertake a task or not. In other words, this would become another source of information and resources for him. After all, the true Martial University regarded him as shady since he had many secrets. His devil wings would be one such example. However, that wouldn't be an issue in the case of this organization. Chapter 468, enters the true martial secret territory. It seemed as if there wasn't any harm in joining this organization. There wasn't any pressure of completing the task. Moreover, he also had the option of completing the tasks and accumulating the points whenever he required extra resources. In short, there was freedom. However, Yi Shiwen also understood that the opposite party would give exciting offers to incite him into completing the missions if they were daring to pledge such a condition. However, this wasn't a bad thing either. Giving an alternative option wasn't a bad thing. Moreover, your sworn enemy the first god has joined another organization. And, that organization is named the Southern Dipper. He may cause you some trouble in the future. Ching Su faintly added. Yi Shiwen's pupils suddenly contracted. He had always been very concerned about the first god's whereabouts. He hadn't cared about the army of God at first. However, he had understood that there was someone very powerful in the army of God when the second god had made an appearance. The second god had also caused a considerable amount of trouble to him. This obviously indicated that the first god must be more powerful since he was above the second god in ranking. However, Yi Shiwen had never heard any news of him. But, he hadn't thought that he would get this news from Ching Su. What kind of an organization was the Southern Dipper organization? It must be an extraordinary organization if Ching Su had mentioned it in such a serious manner. People of the rank of Ching Su had joined the Northern Dipper organization. So, this organization was undoubtedly an extremely terrifying one. Northern Dipper, and Southern Dipper. Why do they sound so similar? Yi Shiwen was silent for a while. Then, he suddenly grinned and asked. Yes, there is some connection. However, there's no need for you to know these things at this time. You will slowly get to know these things if you join our organization. I'm asking you again, will you join? The tall man replied impatiently. It was evident that he didn't wish to give more explanations to Yi Shiwen. Wood Dragon, don't get too impatient. He will probably become your partner in the future. Ching Su laughed and spoke. He seemed quite familiar with Wood Dragon's nature. Wood Dragon didn't say anything. He was just firmly stared at Yi Shiwen in order to see his reaction. Yi Shiwen frowned. He was silent, and didn't say anything. He wasn't worried about his own safety. He had apparently heard some secrets. However, it shouldn't matter much. These things seemed secretive at first, but such matters didn't have any secrets to them in reality. He didn't know anything apart from the name of this organization, Northern Dipper. Not to mention that this was the hidden star peak of the true Martial University. So, these two men had better not provoke any old monster in this vicinity. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be able to run away from here. Yi Shiwen raised his head after he had considered the pros and cons. Then, he smiled and spoke, "I'll join if that's the scene." There were indeed many benefits in joining this organization. And, Yi Shiwen didn't see any harm either for the time being. He would anyway leave this organization if things didn't go well. "Good, I'm glad." Wood Dragon laughed and said. Yi Shiwen got to know a bit about the situation within the Northern Dipper organization once he had agreed to join it. This was an organization that specialized in recruiting only top elites of the younger generation. It didn't have many full-time members if the bottom-level members weren't taken into account. There were only 14 real members apart from the organization's lord. The lord was titled Big Dipper. The 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East constituted 7 seats. And, the remaining 7 seats belonged to the 7 constellations of the Vermilion Bird of the South. These were their 14 members, and they still had vacancies. There weren't even 20 members in this organization at the moment. Yi Shiwen joined, and became the Golden Dragon of the Neck, which was one of the 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East. This position had been kept for Emperor Chen in the beginning. However, it had now fallen into Yi Shiwen's hands. Qing Su was Moon Deer of the Extended Net, that was one of the 7 constellations of Vermilion Bird of the South. And, that tall man who was Yi Shiwen's possible future partner was Wood Dragon of the Horn. This title was also named after one of the 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East, same as Yi Shiwen's title. I will inform you if there will be any task or matter in the future. You can choose to do the task or not. They gave Yi Shiwen a dragon ring and a set of white uniforms once they were done talking. And then, they floated away and departed. Yi Shiwen was a bit dumbfounded as he saw them float away like a feather. They had said that this organization wasn't strict. However, that didn't mean that it was extremely liberal either. However, Yi Shiwen merely smiled. After all, the organization wouldn't put any restriction on his freedom. He could go anywhere he would like to whenever he wouldn't be on an assignment. And, it would depend on him whether he wanted to undertake a task or not. Moreover, there would be no problem even if he didn't complete a single task throughout his career in this organization. However, he would obviously have to complete the tasks if he needed additional benefits. Everything depended on his contribution. He wouldn't be able to enjoy bonuses without contributing any points. He understood this well. After all, an organization needed lots of resources to grow and get stronger. Only then could it give benefits to its members. This was a common thing required for the growth of an organization or a sect. The leadership of this organization would end up getting their heads clamped by the gate if the organization only gave rewards to Yi Shiwen without seeking any returns. In fact, it would have appeared like a huge conspiracy if that had been the case. And, Yi Shiwen wouldn't have joined it in that case. Where in the entire world can a person get free meals? One needs to pay something in order to get something. This is the truth of this world. Yi Shiwen shook his head and laughed as he thought this. He turned towards the hidden star peak, and drew a long shadow under the moonlight as he trod forward. Yi Shiwen, Qi Fifan, and the whole group celebrated Yi Shiwen's win that night. And, he left for the Metropolis Martial Peak without disturbing anybody the next morning. The Metropolis Martial Peak had become the true Martial University's core place. However, the true Martial secret territory's contribution couldn't be ignored either. In fact, everyone knew that it was the most dreadful place in the entire true Martial University. Brother Yi. Zheng Heshu's voice sounded not from afar. He wore a smile on his face as he came over treading the void. Hello, senior brother Zheng. Yi Xuan cupped his hands in obeisance and said. Zheng Heshu didn't exchange any further greetings with Yi Xuan. And, directly came to the point, come with me, let's go to the true marshal's secret territory. Yi Xuan followed Zheng Heshu to the depths of the metropolis Marshal Peak, and arrived at an open and desolate area. They had merely landed when an old man arrived limping. Zheng Heshu promptly stepped forward, and saluted the old man. He said, hello, senior. The Supreme Lord has asked me to bring Yi Xuan to the true marshal's secret territory. The skinny old man looked at Yi Xuan. He let out a smile and said, you're Yi Xuan. Good, very good. It seemed as if he was impressed with Yi Xuan. I'm flattered, senior. Yi Xuan promptly saluted and replied. The way this old man was limping made it seem as if he would be blown away by the wind the next moment. However, Yi Xuan didn't dare to underestimate him. He was the guard of the true marshal's secret territory. How could he be an ordinary person? I must say that there aren't many people in the younger generation who are as talented as you. The old man's eyes flashed. It seemed as if he had seen through Yi Xuan's secrets. He had seen through Yi Xuan's suave aura in just a glance, and had also noticed the fact that he had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Consequently, a trace of amazement had flashed in his eyes. The old man didn't say much. He quickly unwound a seal with his finger. Then, an incredibly large force ripped the void open, and a portal appeared. Rumble. The void had been ripped apart into two halves along with the sound of the explosion, and another world had been exposed. Rivers and interconnected mountains were spread everywhere. There were fresh clouds and gentle winds all around. In fact, it almost looked like a microcosm. Both of them went straight into the true marshal's secret territory. Yi Xuan looked as far as he could. However, it seemed unending. The size of the true marshal's secret territory was simply beyond his imagination. Rich spirit energy blew against his face. It was so strong that he could even see them with naked eyes. It was several times stronger than the spirit energy in the outside world. The underground spirit arteries were boiling. Yi Xuan even suspected that these might be dragon's arteries. Yi Xuan was seeing dragon's arteries for the third time in his life. The first one he had seen had already dried up. Only a few chunks of dragon essence were left in them at the time. He had come across a dragon's arteries for the second time on the planet of the Wind Dragon, but they had been locked up under the ground by some ancient almighty. However, he wasn't sure whether the spiritual arteries located here were dragon's arteries or not. He had merely made a guess. But, he didn't have any proof. And, he obviously couldn't confirm it even if he was right. It was a divine item. Therefore, countless experts must be keeping watch over it since it ensured the true Martial University's prosperity. The biggest difference between dragon's arteries and spiritual arteries was that the former could bring luck and prosperity, and could assist a sect or force in its growth and development. It was quite difficult for a sect's luck energy stock to exhaust if the dragon's veins weren't depleted. Both of them went inside the true Martial secret territory. They passed through many different regions. They also saw many powerhouses who had tyrannical strengths and extremely powerful auras. They were submerged deep in their cultivation. Suddenly, an extremely tyrannical divine sense swept over both of them. Then, it shrank back. These experts are the genuine elites of our true Martial University. Many of them had become famous 1,000 years ago. And, there are also those who had become famous several thousand years ago. Zheng Heshu gave an introduction. These people had once made great contributions to the true Martial University. So, they've been allowed to stay here forever in return. Zheng Heshu explained further. A somewhat desirous look had appeared on his face. To get an opportunity to cultivate here for a year was considered a great fortune. What could only possibly speak of an opportunity to stay here forever? Yi Xuan nodded. He had done some research last night. However, the true understanding of the true martial secret territory couldn't be obtained in one day of research. Even many of the sage experts weren't allowed to stay here for a year, let alone staying here forever. He didn't know what kind of contribution these people had made towards the true martial university that they had received such privilege in return. He couldn't help but became speechless in the secrecy of his heart. Water Moon Fairyland was located in the core place of the true martial secret territory. Zheng Heshu's growth rate wasn't quick, so he really wanted to cultivate here. But Yi Xuan was the one who had arrived to cultivate here at this time, and he had merely guided him till here. He couldn't cultivate here in secrecy. However, it would be great if he could stay here for some more time. Yi Xuan didn't mind that either. So, he also continued to observe the true martial secret territory along the way. Both of them soon entered an endless desert. It was stretched as far as one could see. There were sandstorms billowing everywhere. In fact, the range of these sandstorms seemed nearly endless. Most importantly, Yi Xuan almost didn't feel a bit of spirit energy here. He had been able to feel the world principles very clearly before. However, they were very faintly visible here. In fact, they were almost hard to feel. Chapter 469, He's Really a Freak. It seemed as if this place had experienced the doomsday. The spirit energy of this place had been seemingly used up. The principles were disrupted. Yi Xuan felt as if he had returned to his previous life on the earth, the era of the end of principles. What kind of a place is this? How there can be such a place in the true martial secret territory? Yi Xuan asked. This place had toppled his impression regarding the true martial secret territory. He had previously thought that a place like the true martial secret territory would be filled with heavenly treasures and spirit energy. In fact, he had almost guessed every situation he had seen so far after he had entered this territory. So, he hadn't thought that there would be such a desolate place inside. The sandstorm was rising in the distance. The northern wind was whistling in the endless sand. A figure slowly came out of it in small steps. Not a bit of real elemental energy was fluctuating on his body. Not even the principles were fluctuating on him. He looked like an ordinary person who was facing difficulty in walking through the sandstorm. And it seemed as if he was carrying heavy weight on his body since his feet were getting stuck in the sand with every step he took. It was hard to tell how long it took him, but he arrived near these two men. However, it seemed as if he hadn't seen them since he simply walked past them. He wasn't distracted one bit by their presence. It seemed as if nothing in this world could distract him from his purpose. He went away from them in his usual small-stepped style of walk. However, Yi Xuan clearly noticed that he possessed a terrifying aura. Zheng Heshu opened his mouth and spoke only when that man had gone far away. These people are the hardship cultivators. This world is opened up especially for them. These people might be the strongest of our true martial university. However, they are also a group of lunatics. A scared look had appeared on Zheng Heshu's face when he had spoken the word lunatics. Hardship cultivators. Yi Xuan had seen the records on these people in some ancient books. These were a group of people who bore hardships happily. They would try to use all kinds of methods to torture their body and spirit. And they would gain enlightenment by enduring endless pain. They would sublimate within pain and suffering to learn about the world principles through experience. Zheng Heshu was right when he had addressed them as a group of lunatics. They were a genuine group of madmen. They weren't like the other ruthless experts. The ruthless experts would force their enemies to such an extreme situation from where they might not be able to come out. And even a naive person might transform into an incredibly tyrannical person in the usual style of cultivation. However, these hardship cultivators weren't like that. They were ruthless towards their enemies, but they were even more ruthless upon themselves. They would use all kinds of cruel methods to deal with their enemies, but would use even worse ones upon themselves. So, their minds and bodies were very dreadful. These hardship cultivators were considered the most formidable group of people inside any sect because they weren't afraid of death. They looked like a group of madmen in a real fight because didn't care about their own lives. Moreover, these hardship cultivators rarely went out of their way to provoke others for a fight. However, it would be a dead end for others if they dared to provoke them. Yi Xuan hadn't seen anything on the body of that person. However, he had guessed that this man had probably added a matrix formation on his own body to increase the gravitational force upon himself. This was quite common because these hardship cultivators didn't practice any sort of body power techniques. They would purely rely on such oppressive methods for strengthening their bodies. They believed that human body was God's masterpiece in itself. So, it was the most perfect thing in the entire world in their eyes. Therefore, practicing those body power techniques would transform one's constitution, and would make the human body profane as a result. Only the natural methods were the best in their opinions. This was a simple method. However, it was very difficult to stick to it for a long time. There had been many hardship cultivators among the powerful entities of previous generations. These people weren't born that easily, but they had made the entire world tremble whenever they had taken birth. Yi Xuan couldn't help but secretly swallow his saliva as he saw the figure of that man disappear into the distance. These people genuinely deserved to be called madmen. Cultivating in an environment which was devoid of spirit energy and principles was a very big test of people. A person must laboriously temper their body. And it was even harder in this kind of a situation where one couldn't feel the principles, or utilize their real elemental energy. One must save even a thread of one's real elemental energy to use in such an environment where there wasn't a bit of spirit energy. One might not be able to make a single breakthrough even after one had practiced for 10 years or 100 years in such harsh conditions. However, one would advance by leaps and bounds once they had made the breakthrough. This type of a cultivation method was indeed very harsh. Only a person who possessed great willpower could cultivate under such situation. Otherwise, it was impossible. Yi Xuan admired this harsh cultivation method, but wouldn't use it himself. Both of them left for the centermost place of the true martial secret territory after they had passed through this desolate region. Even a sage expert like Zheng Hexiu had become extremely cautious in this region. The tyrannical divine senses would often sweep past them. However, these probing divine senses eventually disappeared once they had entered the Water Moon Fairyland. Yi Xuan found that a barrier had been laid out around the Water Moon Fairyland, and this barrier had cut off those people's divine senses. Zheng Hexiu pointed towards the surroundings once they reached inside, and spoke, "This is the Water Moon Fairyland. The Water Moon Cave isn't accessible to the outside world in any other way. This is the only path. There are 49 heritages inside the Water Moon Fairyland. And, you can choose any one of them for your comprehension. Even these heritages aren't open to the outside world. However, you're likely to reach the peak of the Great Sage Realm if you comprehend even one amongst them." Zheng Hexiu looked at Yi Xuan with an envious look in his eyes. Each of these 49 heritages was outstanding. One would become extremely powerful if the said individual managed to cultivate even one of them to the depth. However, not everyone could obtain such an opportunity. Even the Heaven's Pride experts must wait for a long time until they had entered the Sage Realm. Only then might they get enrolled for cultivating in this place. He knew that Yi Xuan was the only semi-sage expert who had been allowed to come here. Yi Xuan looked as far as his eyes could see, but he only saw endless plains. 49 stone pillars stood erect on the plain. Each of these pillars was over 10,000 feet tall. There were some inexplicable symbols engraved on each of these pillars. These were possibly ancient seal characters. It was impossible for anyone to understand which race these scripts belonged to. However, one didn't need to read it in order to understand, one only needed to comprehend. That's because the people who had left these writings behind had also engraved their own insights into these stone pillars. And, that meant that one would only need to comprehend those insights. Otherwise, no one would have been able to understand anything if they had only left these writings behind. Several people were sitting upright in front of these 49 stone pillars. Each of them was guarding a pillar, and was deep in comprehension as well. Many of them looked very old, and had long thick beards. They were sitting upright and motionless. In fact, they almost seemed as if they were dead. These seemingly dead figures unexpectedly swept out their divine senses. One among them looked approximately 20 years old. However, his divine sense appeared like an exceptionally sharp sword. It looked like a long sword in the sky as it swept over. A dreadful aura swept into Yi Shiwen's body. He didn't wait for Yi Shiwen to counterattack, and immediately pulled the divine sense back into his body. It happened so fast that Yi Shiwen couldn't even see it. Yi Shiwen was fortunate that the heavenly source mirror was protecting his body. Therefore, the imposing aura of that divine sense had hardly caused any effect on him. Not to mention that he presently wasn't the kind of a person whom anybody could have their own way with. On the contrary, Zheng Heshu had begun to have heartache because of the sudden attack of that imposing aura. "Are you okay?" Yi Shiwen asked. "I'm all right." Zheng Heshu shook his head, smiled, and replied. His complexion had turned somewhat pale. He had obviously replied with a lie. The truth was hidden in his heart. This true martial's secret territory was very strange. A sage expert like him had sustained serious injuries by a person's mere divine sense. Yi Shiwen was obviously even more freakish. A sage expert who stood beside him had sustained injuries. However, he was fine. Moreover, his calm face made it obvious that he hadn't faced any difficulty. It seemed as if he simply hadn't been affected by it. He was truly a freak. However, it was understandable. He wouldn't have been allowed to come here while being in the semi-sage realm if he weren't a freak. Suddenly, several divine senses swept over with a whoosh sound. They read Yi Shiwen's strength, and became somewhat amazed. They recalled their divine senses within a split second. Their time was very precious. So, they couldn't waste it on such a trivial matter. They had only done this to verify that there was no danger. "Can I choose only one of these heritages?" Yi Shiwen asked. "That's right. You can choose only one." Zheng Heshu replied, "In fact, this rule is for your own good. Each of these heritages is supreme. You won't be able to learn anything if you try to study all of them at once." Yi Shiwen understood this point. However, he didn't feel that he couldn't study all of them. He had the help of mysterious space. So, the very question of not being able to study them all was outside the range of his consideration. But, the mysterious space required spirit energy in order to function. And, one shouldn't look at his stock of over 20 million primary spirit dawn as a lot. They seemed to be much at first, but all of it would be gone if he tried to study all of these heritages at once. So, it would be pointless. When it came to learning heritages, it by no means meant that the more secret techniques one knew the better it would get. First, one must take into account which technique would suit well. Secondly, one must see the possibility of being able to cultivate the secret technique to the greater extent. The more profound the cultivation gets, the better it would be for the said individual. He had already started to study his own heritages such as ancient arts and secret techniques. Therefore, the most important thing for him wasn't to learn more and more secret techniques since he had already learnt many secret techniques. Instead, he must fuse these secret techniques together, and turn them into one system. He had learned many secret techniques such as the Phoenix Regeneration Technique, Tyrant Body Technique, Coiling Dragon Palm, Overturning the Heaven Seal, and so on. Each of them possessed wonderful effects and power. However, these techniques had come from different forces, and even from different races. They were scattered. So, Yi Shiwen's priority was to fuse these secret techniques and form one system. He might turn over a new leaf, and form his very own secret technique sooner or later. This was very similar to making the breakthrough into the sage realm from one aspect. He would need to join the scattered and disorderly principles during the breakthrough, and would have to bring them into a situation where they would be separate but non-chaotic. Yishuan had learned many secret techniques by now, and many of them had different systems. So, they weren't compatible, and couldn't operate together without causing inconvenience. There were still obstructions. Therefore, studying all these heritages wasn't something he would choose to do. The fewer the better was certainly his choice considering the amount of primary spirit dawn he had in his pocket. Yishuan proceeded to choose a heritage once he had made up his mind. You're tuning into the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.